Namaskar and greetings on behalf of the Department of History of Ramakrishna Mission Vidyamandira, Belur Math. I extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this very interesting international webinar on global capitalism, colonial politics, and publicity, the past and present of tea in South Asia. It is relevant that we are having this webinar today on the 5th of June, which is celebrated as World Environment Day. This international webinar is being jointly organized by the Department of History, Ramakrishna Mission Vidyamandira, Belur Math, along with the Department of History, University of California, Santa Barbara. We have the privilege and honor to have with us today several scholars, including Professor Erica Rappaport, who is the chair of the Department of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Professor Andrew B. Liu, from the Department of History at Villanova University, Pennsylvania. We also have the honor of having with us Professor Sarah Beskey, who is associated with the Department of Anthropology at Cornell University, and Dr. Debaruti Sen from the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies, University of Houston, along with our very own Professor Prithwiraj Biswas from the Department of History, Ramakrishna Mission Vidyamandira. Before we begin, I would like to inform all the participants who have joined us that they may kindly post specific questions that they may have for individual speakers in the YouTube channel chat box. These would be taken up by the presenters during the interactive session with Professor Erica Rappaport as the respondent after the individual presentations are over. In the true tradition of Vidyamandira, we would like to begin the webinar proceedings with auspicious Vedic chanting by the brahmacharis and monks of our institution.
Sri Gurubhyo Namaha Harihi Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Shanno Mitra Samvarunaha Shanno Bhavatvaryama Shanno Indo Brihaspatihi Shanno Vishnurukramaha Namo Brahmane Namaste Vayu Tvameva Pratyaksham Brahmasi Tvameva Pratyaksham Brahma Vadishyami Ekam Vadishyami Satyam Vadishyami Tanmavatu Tadbhaktaramavatu Avatu Mam Avatu Bhaktaram. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Bhadram Karnebhih Shrunuyama Deva Bhadram Pashimakshabhiryayatra Sthirairangai Stuštuvagam Sastanubhi Vyashema Devahitam Yadayuhu Swasti na Indro Vridhashrava Swasti na Pusha Vishwavedaha Swasti na Staksho Arishkanevi Swasti no Brihaspati Dadatu. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Madhubakarita Madhusharanti Sindhavaha Madhirno Santoshadi Madhunaktamuto Shashi Madhumapati Vaham Rajaha Mahudyaurastu Pita Madhumano Vanaspati Madhumadum Astu Suryaha Madhirgaro Bhavantu Nah. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tatsat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.
After this auspicious chanting, I would now like to kindly request our Principal Maharaj, Swami Ekachittananda, to deliver his welcome address.
Om Namo Bhagavate Ramakrishnaya. Respected and distinguished guest speakers, Professor Erika Rappaport, Professor and Chair of the Department of History, as well as other members of faculty of the Department of History, University of California, Santa Barbara, the head and his associates, Department of History, Ramakrishna Mission Vidyamandira, beloved students of Vidyamandira, and the viewers and listeners who have joined us today, this colorful evening. Let me extend a very hearty welcome to all of you to this international webinar organized jointly by the Department of History, University of California, Santa Barbara, and the Department of History, Ramakrishna Mission Vidyamandira. On this auspicious moment, when the Department of History of both the institutes are going to create history itself, let me express my heartfelt respect and best wishes to all the speakers and distinguished resource persons, and loved good wishes to all my beloved students. Now I feel my task is to introduce our college, a dream child of Swami Vivekananda. Vidyamandira is an autonomous residential college run by the monastic order of Ramakrishna Mission and is located in close proximity to the headquarters of the Ramakrishna Mission in Belur, Howrah, West Bengal. Founded in 1941 as an intermediate degree college, it has already traversed as many as 80 years of sojourn and has acclaimed a number of laurels as well in course of its journey. The college currently runs as many as 14 undergraduate honors courses, 5 postgraduate courses, and 5 PhD programs. It has got a research center named after its propounder himself. The college stood joint 7th in the college category at the national level in the NIRF ranking, the National Institutional Ranking Framework 2020, declared by the Ministry of Education, Government of India in the previous academic session. And to our understanding, we owe this singular achievement to the great visionary, the pathfinder, the cyclonic monk, Swami Vivekananda, the prophet of harmony, who dreamt of synthesizing the best elements of the East and the West in an ideal mode of education, holding aloft the ideals of devotion, wisdom, and morality as illustrated by the Indian seers, and at the same time assimilating the modern tools of science and technology invented by the West. I feel tempted to maintain one fascinating point in this context. Swami Vivekananda, who spoke of universal tolerance and acceptance in the Chicago Parliament of Religions in 1893, and subsequently preached the eternal message of the Vedanta to the length and breadth of the United States, breathed his last on the 4th of July 1902, the very day of American independence, and he was in 39. And exactly after 39 years of his passing away, Ramakrishna Mission Vidyamandira came into existence again on July 4, 1941. We're happy to note that the webinar organized this evening is going to be a very important step towards that direction, the direction set by the great Swami. Let me express my heartfelt gratitude once again to Professor Rappaport and his associates for giving kind consent to our proposal and hosting such a grand academic feast. I pray to the Almighty for the total success of this webinar. Om, peace, peace, peace. Let Almighty protect us all, both the teachers and the students. Let me reiterate the message, exactly what was uttered towards the very beginning of this program, the Vedic hymns chanted by the monastic members of Vidyamandira. Thank you all once again. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om.
Thank you, Principal Maharaj, for your kind words of encouragement. I would now request my colleague and head of the Department of History, Dr. Prithwiraj Biswas, to give his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Shantanu. Namaste. At the onset, I would like to thank Professor Erika Rappaport for agreeing to collaborate and organize this seminar together. 2 years back, when I had first suggested that we should organize a conference to keep our academic conversation going, she had gladly agreed and felt that it was indeed a wonderful idea. And we decided on the theme and started to contact scholars who would be interested to join us. And slowly we got our panel together. And I would like to thank Professor Sarah Besky, Professor Debaruti Sen, and Professor Andrew Liu, who agreed and have joined us today. If the history of tea is as rich as its taste, it is because of historians and researchers of tea like them who have only added to its richness. Personally, it is an honor to be part of a panel that comprises of award-winning historians and scholars of high academic standards. Our initial plan was to organize the webinar sometime in June 2020, but then who would have anticipated that a virus would be turning our lives upside down? We decided to postpone given the circumstances, but kept 2021 in mind. And today, thanks to the active support and cooperation of everyone involved, and irrespective of the fact that some of us have had personal losses, we are all connected to ensure the success of this international webinar. It is a proud moment, not only for the Department of History, Ramakrishna Mission Vidyamandira Belur, but also for our institution, since this is the first international webinar, as Maharaj stated, which has been organized in a collaboration with a foreign university. I would like to keep my speech brief because it is only befitting that a historian of tea should be stating the introductory remarks. So before I end, I would like to thank everyone involved, my co-panelists, colleagues from my department, especially Professor Gautam Mukhopadhyay and Professor Shantanu De, the administration of Ramakrishna Mission Vidyamandira, Brahmachari Jeet Maharaj, who is looking into the technical aspect of today's webinar, students of the Department of History, and Ranjan Babu of the College Office. Finally, I would like to thank each and every one of you, those who are viewing this event live, academics, scholars, students, friends and family members who have joined from various parts of the globe. Thank you for joining us. Now, I would request Professor Erika Rappaport, Professor and Chair, University of California, Santa Barbara, and co-convener of this international webinar, to kindly say a few words. Professor Rappaport.
I think Professor Rapport's backstage. Okay,
There you go.
here we go. Thank you so much. I really want to thank especially Professor Biswas, who, as he said, we've been talking for a long time, but our relationship goes back before that, in that he's helped me so much with my book on tea in terms of helping me get advertising, which I think he may be the only scholar in the world that has as much of an obsession with advertising and tea as I do. So this has really been a pleasure. We are very disheartened when COVID struck and we could not get together. Either I couldn't travel, he couldn't travel, and we couldn't do this in a live setting. But luckily, with the help of all of our tech support, even though I'm sure we'll have some glitches along the way, we're able to at least come together and bring together scholars that I have really been inspired by and excited by for a number of years. And I think I'd like to actually acknowledge the fact that at least, although we've been talking about history, I know that Andrew feels the same way as I do, and Professor Biswas and I are all very much inspired by anthropology, and particularly the work by Pia Chatterjee, who really, her book on tea, A Time for Tea, came out, I think it was in 2001, really inspired me to do this project, to work on the history of tea, and I think many of us. So I just want to acknowledge her presence, even though she couldn't be with us today. I'm just going to say a few remarks to frame the speaker's talk, and then I'll make some comments at the end, and I'll be then managing the questions in the chat at the end. So first of all, I very much want to thank our 4 presenters who've, unlike me, they didn't get up early, but they have come together on a Saturday to, as you'll see, give us fascinating talks that reflect some of their recent work on the history and anthropology of tea. And in many ways, as you'll see, the themes that bring them together really is their way in which they speak to tea's place in the history and the life of global capitalism, and also capitalism's place in creating our taste for tea. Despite the vast differences between the early 19th century and today, our speakers have looked beyond the obvious pleasures we derive when drinking a cup of tea. And indeed, tea is so delicious that it's sometimes hard to be very critical of a plant beverage object that so many people around the world enjoy. But we need to do that, as we'll see today. So all of the speakers, as you'll see, are going to provide us with nuanced, archivally, and ethnographically rich, culturally specific yet transnational portraits of the Indian tea industry and its history. I just want to say a little bit about, of course, I'm obsessed with the history and ethnography of tea, but I think it's part of a larger move that I want to talk about a little bit in scholarship, and why tea is both unique and in many ways not unique compared to other global commodities. So that's something we can be thinking about today. So the recent scholarly attention to tea, which we're exploring, is part of a broader concerns with the relationship between empire and capitalism, and with the historical construction of contemporary globalization. We therefore now have a wave of books and articles on the circulation and meaning of commodities such as cotton, chocolate, coffee, sugar, and opium. These studies, I think, have been very important to critique the centrality of the nation state as an object of analysis. And they've all pointed to the problems with imagining globalization as a recent phenomenon, as a recent post-war phenomenon. They give us a much longer history of globalization. They've also, I think, expanded our understanding of the motives for empire building and the nature and consequences of the colonial encounter. They've urged us to look at imperialism as something which happened both in the metropole and in the colonies, and to regard colonialism as a form of exchange between the colonized and colonizer. Where once commodities were regarded as quantifiable evidence of the value of colonies, they are now studied in their own right as carriers of meaning, sites of contestation, and lenses through which we can see the making and unmaking of imperial, transnational, and local relationships. So tea is very much then has been, especially Indian tea, a global commodity. So I think it's very fitting that we have speakers from all around the world. And an audience from around the world with our own interests and tastes. And so what I want to do now is we'll turn over to Andrew. We're going to go essentially chronologically from early 19th century to the present. And then again, as I said, I'll make some further remarks and then we'll open it up for questions. Okay, so we'll turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you both Dr. Biswas as well as Dr. Rappaport. She has already invited Professor Liu, but I'll just formally invite him anyway. Now we move on to the main proceedings of the webinar, and the first speaker of the day is Professor Andrew B. Liu, who is currently Assistant Professor of History at Villanova University, Pennsylvania. Professor Liu completed his graduation and doctoral dissertation from Columbia University and has been a recipient of several grants and fellowships. His monograph titled Tea War, A History of Capitalism in China and India, has recently been published by Yale University Press in 2020. The topic of his presentation today, which reflects the title of his book, will elaborate the essential features of his thesis. I now request Professor Liu to kindly present his paper.
Great.
Professor Liu.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to share my screen and see. I think it takes a while, so hopefully it'll happen soon. Okay, great. So let me begin by thanking, Erica, thanking Prithwiraj, Biswas, and the Department of History at Ramakrishna Mission Vidyamandira. Thank you to the whole audience, of course, for tuning in during what is, I'm sure, a very difficult and weird time for everyone. For this, very generous invitation to share my work. And I echo Erica's thoughts on the way that, we were all studying tea, but I think we're all studying it for reasons, not just because, we're interested in this commodity and this drink, although that's part of it, right? But it's also because it's kind of stands at the crossroads of all these big questions about the global economy and empire and post-colonialism and so on. So I'm happy she brought that up to begin with, because I think it'll become clear in our presentations that there's bigger stakes in all of our research. So, again, I'll mostly be talking about my book, my one dog-eared copy that I own. It's called Tea War, A History of Capitalism in China and India. And I'll just try to give like 15-minute summary of what I think is interesting about the book. And for those who are interested, I can, of course, correspond afterwards or email, or you can obviously just check it out. And it's a little expensive, so you can find it on all the websites that are, you can get where you get books for free. But basically, the book is a comparative history of the tea trades of China and of India across the 19th century into the early 20th century. In addition to being about tea, though, the question that really consumed me in graduate school and in the revising of the book and all the way to the end was, how do you write a history of capitalism in this part of the world, right? This part of the world meaning, the tea districts of central and eastern China and, of course, of eastern or northeast India, Assam, primarily. And we're talking about parts of the world that appear at first glance very rural and removed from cities and removed from Western Europe. And so it seems very far away from the classic cases of where did capitalism kind of take off in the 19th century. But on the other hand, by growing tea, these regions are also unquestionably connected, right, to the global division of labor. So in some sense, they can't be separated. They're not autonomous from the rest of the world. So it's both simultaneously a history of tea, but also a history of kind of rethinking what capitalism means in the history of Asia. And I think in the subconsciously and in the background of my thinking was, well, what does capitalism mean in Asia today? Or vice versa, how does Asia make us rethink the history of capitalism and capitalism in general, right? So let me, if it's possible, to share my screen. Great, thank you. I'll just kind of talk through some of the basic details of the story. And I'll try to do so by kind of explaining the title of the book, right? Tea War. What does that mean? Well, the inaugural moment of the story comes from this, this moment called the Opium War of 1839 to 1842 between China and the East India Company, or the British Empire at the time. For those, I think most people are familiar with the story, but to just kind of jog everyone's memory, this trade triangle had emerged by the late 18th, early 19th century, in which British goods, a lot of like textile manufactured goods from Britain would go to India, and the profits from selling those textile goods to India would therefore be used to purchase opium from Eastern India and then later Western India. That opium would be brought over to southern China, the port of Guangzhou or Canton, and the profits from the opium would be used to purchase tea, which would be brought back to the British Empire, to the UK, and then it would kind of be distributed all throughout Western Europe. This was a spectacular kind of trade triangle. It was plugged into, or the tea was consumed in Western Europe, mostly with sugar and milk. That's the kind of famous argument by the anthropologist Sidney Mintz. So it was already from the beginning plugged into these networks of Caribbean, slave-based sugar plantations with rural East Asia and rural Eastern India. So these are global networks of commodities and diverse production and labor networks that are just like there from the very beginning. These are not new things. They're actually the premise of the entire story. Now, this Opium War was fought by the British officials not in order to sell opium, to sell drugs to China, right? Instead, they said, we want to fight this war to liberalize trade, to free, the economic system of China from the constraints of monopoly and so on. At the exact same moment in the 1830s that the British are kind of ramping up for war, they also begin to experiment with their own sort of their own tea industry within their own colonial territories of, at this point, Eastern India, or this recently acquired territory called Assam. And similarly, they explained the reason they want to start growing tea in Assam on the logic of, quote, annihilating and, quote, destroying the Chinese monopoly, right? So in this sense, Indian tea was justified on the same grounds as the Opium War was justified. For that reason, I kind of argued that Indian tea, we could think of Indian tea historically as the Opium War by other means, right? It's a sort of imperial, it's a move of imperial expansion, one through military means, one through economic means. So the tea war of the title is really kind of has two meanings, right? The first is, as I just mentioned, it's a play on the idea of opium war. We have a tea war. We have a war that's fought through the production of tea, a sort of economic warfare rather than military warfare. The second, more central meaning of the book is the fact that it refers to what happens after the 1840s. After the Opium War with China, Chinese trade is quote unquote liberalized. There's a lot more treaty ports that get opened up. This is kind of the moment of semi-colonialism in Chinese history. And alongside with that, with all these treaty ports opening up all around, Shanghai and Guangzhou and the southeast, Fuzhou and Xiamen, all these ports, tea sales to the rest of the world also skyrocket, right? At the same moment, or in the same period in the late 19th century, tea production out of Assam, especially, eventually begins to skyrocket by the 1870s and 1880s, and this is a direct competition for the global tea trade. We have British colonial planters based in India who refer to this as the tea war, right, between China and India. And similarly, in China, we have, for instance, one famous Chinese economic writer, who refers to the onslaught of competition for commodities such as silk, cotton, and tea, which they refer to as the commercial warfare, 商战 in Mandarin. So to me, what was really striking then is you have these participants in global trade on the British colonial Indian side, on the Chinese side. They don't talk to each other. They're not communicating with each other, but they are both using this metaphor of warfare, of militarism, to describe what is economic life in the late 19th century. So this kind of indicated to me the way to frame the book then is it's not about India, it's not just about China, it's about this global process of warfare or of economic competition. And what does competition mean and what does it do to local conditions, local everyday life in the tea districts of China, in the tea districts of India? It's a mutually determinative process, right? That's not just one group exerting power over other groups. They all kind of exert power or influence over each other. We have a process that involves Indian, Chinese, British actors. They all play different roles and in different relationships at different moments over the course of a century. And the final plot point I will mention is that something kind of shocking happens by the 1890s, which is that, at the beginning of this process, Chinese tea had this monopoly over the global tea trade. It was the one place that people in the rest of the world would buy tea from. It was unthinkable and shocking that within a few decades, Indian tea, British colonial Indian tea, from Assam would take off so quickly, it would actually overtake the Chinese tea trade and send it into sort of a crisis by the early 20th century. This leads to all sorts of explanations at the time, very simplistic explanations. Well, why does Chinese tea fail? Why is Indian tea, which is read as, British Western tea, why does it succeed? And it leads to what we can kind of predict now as kind of classic civilizational Orientalist arguments about how, well, Chinese society is backwards and fallen behind. Indian tea, with the benefit of Western science and colonialism, is actually able to kind of import Western methods that are superior to Asian methods, basically, right? And we have advertisements from the time that from the Indian Tea Association that that other people have written about, that really indicate how at the time this was perceived and projected as a civilizational battle. There's of a East versus West, right? And of course, the weirdness, of course, is that the West in this case is kind of India, or India and the Ceylonese industries, which are coded as having benefited from the advent of colonialism, right? So the arguments are that Eastern Japanese and Chinese teas are dirty, unclean. They're not made by machines, whereas the benefit of machine manufacture has produces South Asian teas that are clean and pure, and so on and so forth. And I think this image, which is also in Erica's book, is kind of the clearest indication. It's also like a very funny, but also like kind of beautiful image, right? Of this idea that this is really a referendum on East versus West. And even though this is a very exaggerated, and you can't really use this image today without getting canceled, I think that actually the arguments, the logic behind this image still are actually quite rampant throughout a lot of history, social science, academic literature on the study of tea, right? Which is that Indian tea thrived because of its sort of civilizational characteristics of Western colonialism, and Chinese tea failed because it was traditional and backwards and so on. Much of the book then is to kind of overcome these civilizational explanations by connecting the stories of the two, showing how they weren't actually all that different, how they were kind of overlapping in many ways, how Indian tea really drew upon Chinese tea at the beginning, and then Chinese tea reformers in the 20th century actually traveled to India to study what's going on in India, and so on. So it's looking at how these places are actually connected, not that different from each other, and how they're also mutually impacting each other through this story of competition. In particular, I'm looking at, I guess you could call it a sort of social labor history of how is tea being produced and organized in these parts of the world, but also an intellectual history. What are the concepts and ideas of Asian backwardness that are getting produced in this moment? How can the story of tea kind of stand in for this broader intellectual history? The basic claim then is that these particular notions of backwardness in Asia are paradoxically the products of global dynamism, right? The paradox is that we have this idea of particularities of different Asian cultures or societies that is a product of global processes. Backwardness is a byproduct of a global dynamic process, right? Just to give you a sense of the scale of the argument, how much does tea matter, basically, right? Chinese tea is by far the most exported commodity in the 19th century, both in terms of volume and value. In India, tea is, depending on what you're looking at, I'd say like a top 3 or 4 commodity. It has the most registered companies, the most overseas investment. And by the 1920s and 30s, I discovered there were more workers attached to tea in India or tea in China than there were workers in the sort of comparable urban industries like textile or jute manufacture, cotton manufacture in Asia, right? So in a sense, these were the biggest capitalist industries in Asia at the time. So in a sense, my argument then is that tea is inescapable or something that can't be avoided when talking about the history of capitalism in this part of the world. I know I'm running short on time, so let me just kind of jump forward and kind of show some images of what exactly I'm referring to. In China, this is one image of what happened in China was tea was very segmented. It was not vertically integrated. And so you had these this kind of this network that emerged in which individual land-owning peasants would grow tea on their own land, bring them to the marketplace, which is what this image is showing. And you can see in these are just bags and bags of raw leaves. And these are bags of leaves that the peasants are going to sell to the factories. The factories buy the bags of raw leaves and then they roast them and do whatever. And then they sell them to the treaty ports in Shanghai. So this is like in the village. And this is a very segmented process. I get into the labor process of tea itself, how it actually was quite rationalized and industrialized in very subtle ways, in ways that would be recognizable to a kind of classic industrial society such as Manchester, England, right? Obviously, it's not mechanized and not not highly capitalized, right? But in a very basic sense, the social dynamics of tea production do change as a result of competition. Similarly, in India, we have stories. In India, unlike in China, they have to create a tea industry, quote unquote, from scratch, and they do so by clearing land, hiring large workforces using unfree labor conditions, right? I think everyone is mostly familiar with the sort of labor indenture laws that were used in the late 19th century. And they were created these were known as tea gardens that were very comparable to, cotton plantations or haciendas in the Americas, right? So this looks like very much a factory in the field, large workforces clearing land to work at high economies of scale. There were fantasies in India that they would eventually use that sort of Western science to replace the workforce and just make it a fully mechanized process. I think we all know that never came to fruition. The tea today is still a very labor-intensive process, and so I kind of really dig into the sort of the labor processes and how, in spite of fantasies such as the ones in this image of full mechanization in India, in fact, I think the competitive advantage of the Indian tea industry was not its mechanization. It was actually the colonial labor laws that allowed them to super exploit, to extract even more labor out of the quote unquote coolie workforce, migrant workforce that was brought to Assam in the late 19th century. And the last thing I'll say, just as a quick example of sort of intellectual history and something that might be a particular interest to this audience, is that I do have the kind of final chapter. I trace the rise of labor indenture, of these unfree labor laws in Assam. I also trace the end of them, and I kind of do so by looking at, in the late 19th century, Indian nationalist literature, and in particular, Bengali nationalist literature. I try my best to read some Bengali literature, novels, short stories, plays that depict, the sort of terrible working conditions in Assam, written in Bengali. So they're obviously for Calcutta intelligentsia audiences. They're not actually based in Assam. But I read those plays and try to figure out what is the argument they're making for why labor indenture is so bad. And I connect it with a sort of global moment of economic and political liberalism that is, of course, really symbolized by the abolitionist movement in the Americas. And these Bengali writers, they explicitly borrow from sort of United States abolitionist literature, such as Uncle Tom's Cabin. And what does that mean? Is it anti-colonial? Is it anti-Western? Is it anti-modern? It is an argument. The arguments are really about how free labor, proletarian labor, capitalist labor is actually good and natural, and therefore the sort of unfree labor indenture laws in Assam were bad and pre-modern and should be gotten rid of. But ultimately, this shows that the Indian nationalists and their protests against tea labor in Assam were really advocating for an argument about the commercialization and naturalization of capitalist labor processes in India. And to me, that's a reflection of how India itself, Eastern India, Bengal, the Bengal presidency, Assam, was undergoing these subtle social transformations towards a sort of, export-oriented, commodity-producing capitalist society in very subtle ways that kind of make us rethink these old ideas about how, India or China or Asia was not capitalist and only England was capitalist and so on and so forth. It actually, if we kind of reorient or rethink the way that we define capitalism or conceptualize these terms, we could find subtle traces of these dynamics at work in the literature or in the sort of close examination of the production process of these commodities. So that's the last thing I'll say, and I can obviously talk more in depth about any of these things later on in the Q&A, but hopefully this is a useful introduction to the argument of the books.
Thank you, Professor Liu, for setting the tone, basically, for this seminar with your very broad historical analysis of tea production, trade, and contestation in the age of imperialism. So thank you for that. And I think there would be many questions which would come up in the Q&A section. Now we move on to the second speaker. The second speaker of the day is my departmental colleague, Dr. Prithwiraj Biswas. Dr. Biswas completed his master's degree from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and his doctoral dissertation from the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Kolkata, on advertisements, manufactures, and consumer culture of colonial Bengal, circa 1880 to 1920. He has written a number of articles on the history of advertising practices in colonial India and Bengal specifically, Swadeshi advertising and enterprise, Swadeshi fairs, fashion, and various other such issues. At present, he is working on a book which is more or less based on the research theme that he has pursued over the course of the PhD. The topic of today's presentation is advertising Lipton's tea in colonial Bengal, a short study. I request Dr. Biswas to kindly present his paper.
Thank you, Professor Day, for such a generous introduction. So just let me set the PowerPoint. So, as Professor Day rightly mentioned, the title of my paper is Advertising Lipton's Tea in Colonial Bengal, a short study. So what I'm going to talk about are essentially some stray thoughts based on a select study of Lipton's advertisements of tea, sorry, which I chanced upon a long time back when I was researching for my doctoral degree. Of course, at that time, I never anticipated that one day I could actually be presenting a paper based on them in a webinar, and that too with experts on tea history as my co-panelists. Anyway, while working on the ads, I realized what a fascinating story it tells us about tea and British Empire and the way it influenced advertising. And I thought the webinar was a great opportunity to share my thoughts with scholars on tea and see what they feel and suggest. It would be a great learning experience. Now, Lipton's business in India date back to 1889, and the initial advertisements of Lipton were released only in local European-owned newspapers in Bengal at the cusp of the 20th century. And these advertisements reflect a set pattern involving lots of text crammed with information, and illustrations were almost rare. You know, for example, something like this. The one on the left is Lipton's, as you can see, and the other one is a local company. And this one was really, the Lipton's one was released in the Times of India, and the other one in the Statesman. Now, it informed readers about Lipton stores in Calcutta, agents located throughout India and Burma, from where Lipton's tea could be procured. And it can be seen that the store at Hare Street, Kolkata was already pretty large, occupying 4 premises, and readers were informed that they could buy Lipton's tea available in various weights, an innovation that sprang from Lipton's commercial acumen, which would have appealed to a wide range of customer budgets. To highlight the freshness and purity of the tea, the advertisement also informed readers that the teas were sold in patent airtight tins, and one could enjoy Lipton's tea as if they were bought straight from the tea garden to the teapot, a slogan which became popular and was regularly featured in the advertisements. These initial advertisements were moderately sized, occupying 2-3 columns width and about 4-6 inch height of newspaper space. The standard line and logo format was adopted with various degrees of stylized fonts, which expressed that Lipton's tea was patronized by the royalty. However, by the end of the first decade of the 20th century,
I would like just to interrupt you a minute, Professor Biswas. Actually, could you just go to the slideshow presentation? People are not being able to see the slides properly. So if you could just play the slideshow.
It's there in the, I mean...
No, it's not full screen, actually. It's not full screen.
Is it? But in my screen, it's showing it's full screen.
No, it still hasn't come, actually. Could you try? Okay, it had come. Yeah. Okay, please carry on. Okay.
Can you see now? This is the one. This is the title one.
It still hasn't come, unfortunately. But anyway, I'm sorry. Please continue.
What about now?
No, still not. But please don't stop your flow.
I think I can see it on YouTube.
Okay. Please carry on. Sorry for the interruption. Yeah.
So anyway, so what I was talking is the sorry.
Basically, it's still in the first slide. People are not being able to see the other slides. Have you gone to the other slide?
I don't know. I mean, I've moved on to the next slide, but I can't understand why it's not.
No, it is not moving actually on screen. So
then it's a.
I'm not sure as to
because
what can be done. Yeah, now it has come. It just came and it flipped back. It just came. Go on to the second slide, please. Yeah. It is working now.
Is it okay?
Yeah, it is. Please carry on.
But can you see full screen or just full screen? Full screen.
No, it is still not full screen, but we are able to see it anyway. It's not full screen, but we are able to see it.
What about now?
No, unfortunately, still not. It hasn't come on screen fully.
I don't know.
But this is. Could you just play the slideshow once more?
Let's keep it.
Slideshow once more.
Yeah.
It has come to the second slide now.
Okay, I think let's keep it as that, as long as you can see.
Okay. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Interrupting the flow of the. Anyway, so what I was trying to say is that by the end of the first decade of the 20th century, when advertisements of Lipton's tea first appear in the Bengali, they had undergone a dramatic change. And as we shall see presently, all of them were full-page illustrated advertisements, which were more like posters actually, released every month for successive months from December 1911 till August 1913. And these wanted readers to associate tea drinking with only one brand, that of Lipton's and no other. Designed by E.T. McCluskey and K.G. Cornelius and Company, who were advertising designers, captions in these new sets of advertisements were kept at a minimum to let the visuals speak for themselves, or at most complement them. These advertisements were truly reminiscent of the flamboyance for which Thomas J. Lipton was by now famed. He had already won an award for tea promotion in the Chicago World Fair of 1893. It's the same Chicago, fair where which Swami Vivekananda had also visited, and knighted by Queen Victoria in 1898 for his services to the society. It should be recounted that the tea culture of colonial Bengal, when Lipton's was seeking to expand, was by and large limited to the Europeans and their anglicized associates. This is what probably Lipton's aimed at changing, and Bengali was chosen since it was enjoying a large circulation and had grown into a reliable vehicle for both indigenous and foreign advertisers. In fact, Bengali, edited by the nationalist Surendranath Banerjee, was the first Indian-owned newspaper to take the services of Reuters news agency to satisfy the demands of readers who wanted to keep themselves updated on the latest news. But there could be more reasons for choosing the Bengali, as we shall see later in the discussion. Now, to make easy understanding, there are a lot of students also, I've selected 10 of about 21, 22 advertisements and divided the first 8 into 2 sets of 4 ads based on the message they seem to suggest. Thereafter, if time permits, I shall take you through a few more to show how these ads taken together actually reflect the story of the British Empire and the history of tea, which was so very interconnected and something which Erica and other historians have written so nicely. Now, the first advertisements of the new series is reflective of Lipton's propaganda centering on colonial politics of contemporary South Asia, and clearly Lipton took advantage of the hype and controversy surrounding those events. The earliest of the 4 was released a week after the Delhi Darbar, where December 1911, where King George V, the only sovereign to have attended any imperial Darbar at Delhi, was proclaimed King Emperor of India. Drawing on images which one could easily associate with the Darbar, the advertisement replicated a scene from the event depicting a trumpeter of the royal cavalry blowing on a trumpet to proclaim the new king. At first glance, it appears so, but when the eye reads the cleverly worded caption just below the trooper, the duality of the communique becomes evident. It alluded to actual events of the Darbar, but cheekily proclaimed Lipton's tea as the king of beverages. Advertisements of tea were not uncommon in the local newspapers of colonial Bengal. At that time, and these are some examples that you see on the screen, but full-page advertisements were rare, and this was the first full-page advertisements released by any tea company till then in the Bengali. It was intended to create a visual impact on the readers, somewhat like the Darbar, which was a visual spectacle that celebrated the might of the British Empire. Also, the advertisement was a kind of power statement, on part of Lipton's, the power to own pay for a single page. Advertisements are very expensive. If I remember correctly, a 4-line ad used to cost 1 rupee. And the average salary of a professor was around 50 to 75 rupees. So this will give you an idea. Now, the advertisement was a power statement, a statement to also proclaim that Lipton's was the king of tea, the best one could buy. Now, on 12th December 1911, the day of the actual coronation at Delhi, which newly proclaimed King Emperor of, proclaimed King George V, the King Emperor, he announced the transfer of the government of India from Calcutta to Delhi. And this immensely significant announcement generated a lot of controversy and evoked strong sentiments from various quarters, but particularly from Bengal, since the province had since tumultuous days centering on the partition of the province. And though the partition was annulled by the new king in the same Darbar, the removal of the imperial capital from Delhi to Calcutta offended Bengali sentiments, as Bengal was raised to the status of a governor's province. An uneasy situation continued to haunt the Indian scenario, and you probably know that there was an attempt on the life of the Viceroy Lord Hardinge. Anyway, clearly unwilling to let go of the creative impulse that the situation had presented and aware of the excitement surrounding the decision, Lipton, while alluding to the change in capital, released an advertisement that stated, Whichever may be the capital city, Lipton's would always be capital T. The illustration featured the Jama Masjid to symbolize Delhi and the governor's house to signify Calcutta, and perhaps to portray the new status. Delhi is placed on the top, Calcutta below. And the word Lipton superimposed on the alphabet T, highlighted in bold and in capital, suggestively connects both the cities as far as the choice of T was concerned, but which were otherwise miles apart from each other, both geographically, historically, traditionally. The message implied changes in the temporal world, but constants in the world of tea, since it was claimed that Lipton's would always be the principal choice of tea drinkers. What we see here is that Lipton's advertisements for tea was not just part of a large publicity campaign, but also signified purchasing the best tea produced by the empire, even during the time of great political change. Now, the third advertisement of the series featured a chest of Lipton's tea atop the howdah of a stately elephant, which is caparisoned and flanked by armed lancers. A mahout guides the majestic beast as it leads a ceremonial procession of Lipton's tea chests. Clearly, the memories of the Delhi Darbar had lingered on in public memory to justify such an image even after 2 months had elapsed. The caption accompanying the image pronounced that Lipton's tea was always in the van, to suggest that it was the leading brand of tea in the empire. This message was further reinforced in the next advertisement, released the following month. I'm sorry, it's a bit hazy. Through the portrayal of Britannia, the embodiment of power standing on a shield, which is a map of the world superimposed on the Union flag. While her feet rests on the map of India, her outstretched hand holds a cup of Lipton's tea, to show that Lipton's is the preferred drink worldwide. Such depiction, however, was not new and had parallels with advertisements of similar nature released by other tea companies, which covertly celebrated the strength of Britain, juxtaposing it against the submissiveness of the Asian countries under its rule while promoting tea's global expansion. Now, having aggressively pitched for his brand through an overarching narrative of Western imperialism, Lipton then concentrated on addressing the diverse readership of Bengali to foster a conscious affinity towards drinking Lipton's tea. It should be mentioned that since the 1880s, personal antipathy and social opposition to tea had matched the propaganda to drink tea. There were speculation of the supposed ill effects of tea on one's health, as by regular reporting in the press about inhuman treatment of tea workers in plantations. Incidentally, Bengali was one of the newspapers which had always highlighted the plight of tea workers. Thus, when Lipton was advertising in the Bengali, he had to rework his campaign, keeping in mind that his readers were aware of this fact. This is reflected in the next set of 4 advertisements, which were created specifically to address those concerns of readers and additionally offer special reasons to drink Lipton's tea. But in order to be more effective and reach them, Lipton decided to target specific groups one by one, offering them a variety of reasons to drink Lipton's tea. The first advertisement, and this has been much discussed by others too, the one on the left, was intended for the Anglophone elite of Bengal who aspired to the lifestyle of the European and British counterparts. It was aimed to transport the consumer to a world where he could enjoy a cup of Lipton's tea straight from the tea garden against a serene backdrop of the plantation. The oft-used caption accompanying the illustration, "Straight from the garden to the teapot," accentuated the image, promising freshness in each cup of Lipton's tea. It was projected that tea drinking was a marker of cultural refinement and social mobility. To that end, the advertisements used images which were more suited for a Western audience, but were nevertheless created with the hope that these images would strike a chord with the colonial subjects and drive home the intended message with regards to the product and its benefits. In fact, the one you see on the right was probably the intended target audience, and this is what they envisaged. But what they were trying to project is, a kind of romanticized setting. And I mean, those who are not familiar with this advertisement would find it strange, but this is very interesting. When the private British companies were advertising in India, and even the East India companies, other tea sort of, the empires, other companies. So they would be using, their own subjects, to civilize the colonized. But tea historians have seen advertisements which were released in newspapers in England, which actually use colonized subjects. So it was just the reverse in this case. Okay. Now, so these images make it clear that advertisers like Lipton's exploited and created constructs that were useful to them. The following month, Lipton released an advertisement that was far removed from the romanticized setting in the one that we just saw. It featured a priest in his frugal quarters, and I found it very strange, actually. And then when I read Erika Rappaport's book, then I realized the reason why. I'm coming to that. So it featured a priest in his frugal quarters. I was just wondering when, I was transporting myself to those times and imagining myself as an Orthodox Hindu opening the Bengali, and I see a huge, poster-like advertisements of a missionary and urging me to drink tea. What would I be? What will I be thinking? These were the things that were going on in my mind. Anyway, so the priest is troubled by the fact that his stock of Lipton's tea was exhausted. An empty Lipton's tin with its lid open lies near his feet to highlight his predicament. And the caption suggests that he yearns for a cup of Lipton's tea. The choice to depict a Christian priest in the advertisement to change consumer taste towards tea, as I stated, might appear surprising, even controversial, given the attitude of Indians towards their religion. However, it seems, as Erika Rappaport has discussed, there were more to the message than just to these kind of messages. If they were used in England, I don't know. I've seen this in Bengali, and this is what I'm trying to bring up. She would be able to, comment better. That tea was actually a sacred and useful pleasure. In Britain, evangelicals had long insisted that the consumption of tea demonstrated the rewards of a religious and sober life. In fact, in 1785, evangelical poet William Cowper captured the sentiments well when he labeled tea as a cup that cheers but does not inebriate. And all these, and thanks to the book of Erika Rappaport that I got all this information. And this had aided the temperance activists and the temperance movement in its effort to create a sober consumer culture in early industrial Britain, but there were reservations. It's not that simple. Anyway, the reason we suggest this here is because alcoholism was also a major problem in colonial Bengal. And even though the activities of missionaries were viewed with suspicion and skepticism, they were also part of the temperance movement in India, which had started in the 1870s, and it had linked with the English temperance agitators. So I was just wondering if it can be suggested that Lipton was also trying to link tea, temperance, and the role of missionaries to change the attitude of society, not only towards the missionaries, but also towards tea as a beverage. In fact, these images can also be identified with the empire's civilizing mission of the colonial subjects. Moving on to the last two. The history of tea informs us that 18th century witnessed the domestication of tea in Britain. This meant that tea was transformed from an exotic luxury consumed primarily by men to a necessity of everyday life enjoyed by both men and women in the private domestic space of the home. And thereafter, roughly from the 19th century, tea was associated with privacy, intimacy, nuclear family. Tea drinking became the scene of domestic converse and agreeable relaxation. So possibly the next advertisement reflects that. It seemed to encapsulate those values and was addressed to upper middle class, educated Indian women belonging to nuclear families living in the cities. What was actually suggested is the one, the picture that you see on the right. This was released sometime in 1920, but the one which was released is, of course, the one on the left. So the caption suggested that Lipton's tea was what every woman liked. This was further reinforced by the next advertisement that showed a lady choosing Lipton's tea. Close to her heart. She's holding Lipton's tea, and her refined demeanor reflected in the manner by which she holds the box of Lipton tea close to her heart, and refuses other tea brands that has been offered to her, while stating, "This I will have, or I will have none," which was actually a line from Shakespeare, The Taming of the Shrew. Images like these clearly show how English values were being imposed onto foreign cultures, implying that colonial space was not merely to be invaded, but now it has to be domesticated for the sake of commerce and for the sake of the empire. I was also wondering if Lipton's tea is signified as Petruchio and the lady as Catherine, to signify perhaps the woman who prefers Lipton tea and knows her duties as a wife. But this is something I have to discuss with my friends from the English department. And maybe. Anyway. So the last advertisement is fantastic in its representation of the brand's supposed aficionados. And Lipton was quite clear about the target audience. Here they included the upper echelon of the society, like the image on the top. Clearly, I mean, I don't know whether you can see, but it's written a Maharaja, general, and the member of a council drinking tea while possibly discussing the affairs of the state. Below them, the words masses enjoy the same brand. And when I saw this, the first thing that came into mind was the cover of Erica's book. It almost has the same kind of image, but the only difference is that there you have soldiers, of the Indian Army fighting in the Western Front. So anyway, the images of the railway guard, the soldier, and the chauffeur, each with a cup of Lipton's tea, and the caption state, "All sorts and condition of men drink and enjoy Lipton's tea." And possibly because it thought that Lipton's tea was a favorite beverage drink of all, it was time to proclaim once more that the company had what the company wanted to state all along. Lipton's was the finest tea the world produces. So this is what I was just trying to read through these advertisements. Of course, tea experts would probably comment or better, but I found those fascinating because what I found in these 10 advertisements is, if you just think, just think of these, the first 8 advertisements, it's just like the British Empire and how it kind of controls the colony. A king is proclaimed, the capital is selected, then there's consolidation, and then you have various agencies, who are controlling the empire and the colonies. The general is there, the missionary is there, the soldier is there, you have the elite, the officials. So I found this series fantastic, and it almost captures what tea history is, of course, very complicated, but I found that this is a fantastic series, and I must bring this up and discuss it with the experts on tea history. So that is all from my end. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Biswas, for your fascinating presentation. and for providing us such a beautiful array of print-related advertisements from colonial India. In fact, much of it was completely unknown, at least to me and for most of us, I presume. I'm sorry to have interrupted you between your presentations, but anyway, moving on. Yeah, moving on. We now move on to the third speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Sarah Besky. Professor Besky is a cultural anthropologist and associate professor in the ILR School and the Department of Anthropology at Cornell University. She completed her doctorate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she used ethnographic and historical methods to study the intersection of labor, environment, and capitalism in the Himalayas. She has authored 2 books, namely The Darjeeling Distinction, Labor and Justice on Fair Trade Tea Plantations in India in 2014, and Tasting Qualities, The Past and Future of Tea in 2020, both published from the University of California Press. Apart from this, she has also written various articles and co-edited a volume titled How Nature Works, which is more of a theoretical work. Her new research explores the intersections of agricultural extension and experimentation, colonial and post-colonial governance, and everyday productive and reproductive work in farming in the Himalayan region of Kalimpong in West Bengal. So the topic of our presentation today is tea words, experiments with quality in Indian tea production. I request Dr. Besky to kindly present her paper. Over to you. I think you're still in mute mode. Professor Besky, I think,
Okay,
yeah,
there it is.
now it's
Sorry,
good, yeah.
I did this swirly thing when I tried to
That's
unmute
okay.
myself.
It was buffering.
Sorry,
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
quite terrifying. I'm back. Okay. Sorry. Anyway, technological disasters. Thank you so much, Shantanu, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Prithwiraj. Thank you to the other presenters for what's already been a really lovely conversation. And thank you, obviously, to everyone sharing their Saturday with me. Oops, and us. Let me share my screen. I know that it's going to take a second to do so. Go allow. And can you see all of that? Okay, well, I can't see the chat anymore, so please yell at me if it is not working. Okay, so I am also going to kind of give a little snippet of my most recent book, Tasting Qualities, The Past and Future of Tea. So black tea comes predominantly from former European colonies, from East Africa to Southeast Asia. In these places, tea is plucked, pruned, fermented, dried, rolled, sorted, and packaged on plantations. From plantations, tea is shipped to auction centers in former colonial port cities like Calcutta, Colombo, and Mombasa, where brokers taste it and evaluate it before selling it at public auctions. Calcutta is the heart of the Indian tea industry. Brokers here evaluate over half of the tea produced in North India. Millions of kilograms pass through the hands, under the noses, and across the tongues of these brokers. Tea brokerage is a specialized job. Membership in social clubs, facility with English, European kind of sartorial style, and athletic prowess are all signs of one's qualification. On a Tuesday morning in 2009, I joined a broker on the top floor of Nilhat House, India's oldest auction center in Calcutta. Mr. Paul, a tall, thin, avuncular man, was lecturing apprentice brokers about how to properly evaluate tea in order to give it a valuation price for the weekly auctions that his firm oversaw. A group of assistants quietly brewed dozens of tea samples, carefully timing the steeping of leaves with British-made white enamel clocks. Mr. Paul waxed about tea's remarkable variability. It's an agri-product, he stressed, so this is a natural variability. A broker's expertise is measured by his, and yes, it is almost always his, ability to corral tea's tastes, looks, smells, and textures into a few words, drawn from a fixed English glossary. For example, here's how another broker, Mr. Dutta, evaluated an invoice of tea. He slurped one tea, then the next. Tippy clonals have fair make. More emphasis on sorting would be of benefit. He smelled the pile of steep leaves and then slurped the liquor. Mixed. Fannings acceptable. Colonial has brightness and character, but quality is not there. He slurped another cup, a little short in appearance and also not entirely clean. Bloom is lacking. Mr. Dutta poured the dry leaf of the next invoice onto a piece of cardstock. He kind of shook it back and forth, giving it a few flicks with the backs of his fingertips, before bending the cardstock in his hand and funneling the tea back into the bag. Printed on the top of each piece of cardstock Mr. Dutta used are the words, "It pays to make good teas." This phrasing is instructive. Brokers do not see themselves as merely separating the good from the average or the subpar. They explicitly understand their work as one of active making, of bringing good teas into being. For them, qualification pays. It is quite literally remunerative to them, to sellers and to buyers, because it is part of the production process. In this way, tea tasting exemplifies a dialectic between techne, or kind of knowledge as embodied craft or skill, and episteme, or knowledge as a kind of systematic classification. And in many ways, brokers are aesthetic experts, not unlike storytellers or visual artists. On the techne side of the dialectic, they must hone an ability to craft subjective experiences of taste into words and numbers. On the epistemic side, brokers are guardians of a system of classification and valuation. They are part of a colonially rooted commodity infrastructure that spans from remote tea plantations to antique coal-fired processing factories to the bronze scales, stained ceramic cups, and aprons of the tasting room here at Milhouse.
I'm just sorry, Professor Besky. Have you moved on to the other slides from the first slide?
Yes.
But I think we are still stuck in the first slide as far as the audience is concerned.
My third slide, and it's.
Could you just press F5? F5 perhaps.
I have a Mac. Does that work on Macs?
I'm not sure that I'm not a technical expert, but yeah, now it has moved. Yeah.
Okay, so I just won't use the slideshow function.
Yes, sure.
All right, so it's just going to look like this.
Sorry.
I don't know. Okay, so I have animations. You're just not going to see the animations because it won't work in not slideshow version.
But please do it manually, and it's. I think it would be visible to us.
Not just, really. But that's okay.
Yeah.
So as much as numerical price, it's words like a make, character, and brightness that indicate a tea's quality. A list of some 150 terms is published by the Calcutta Tea Traders Association and rendered on glossy posters that adorn brokerage firm walls. Today, I'll tell the story of these tea words to argue for a view of quality as an experimental relationship between bodies, materials, and markets. A relationship that is grounded in histories of the plantation and colonial science. In keywords, Raymond Williams identifies a certain kind of concept, one for which the problems of its meanings seem inextricably bound up with the problems it was being used to discuss. Quality is one such concept. Quality gained prominence in the tea industry discourses between the 1930s and the 1950s, just as the authority of colonial actors was coming under question. This was an experimental moment. A fixed lexicon for describing quality was first advocated not by brokers, but by scientists employed by the Indian Tea Association or the ITA, a guild, and I kind of use that word deliberately, a kind of guild of British plantation-owned plantation companies. But drawing on historical and ethnographic research, I approach quality importantly not as an end to itself, not as a final destination for imperial, economic, or post-imperial projects. Instead, quality continues to reanimate those projects. So in an interview with me, a Nilhat House broker, I'll call Mr. Chetal, described learning to be a broker in this way. You train and train, and one day you realize you're training yourself through your own processes of experimentation. He's referring to a broker's need to creatively combine his sensory faculties, his familiarity with the terms in the glossary of tea words, and his knowledge about the dynamics of the market. For tea brokers, experimentation is with words at the same time experimentation with things and with bodies. The ability of the broker's body to sense tea is both an outgrowth of plantation production and a means of reproducing it. As Mr. Chetal explained, if I said stewy to you, what would you think? It has the characteristics of a stew, right? Thick, cloudy, but that's not what it means at all. Its meaning is much more exact. It refers to the exhaust temperature. It means that a tea was fermented at too high a temperature, that it over-fermented, and has therefore become soft. So in his work, and so this slide isn't actually going to work, so I'm just going to kind of skip over. Maybe I'll. Now it's completely okay. Anyway, this slide's not going to work. It has great effects, but you'll just not see it. In his work on the terms used to describe wine, the anthropologist Michael Silverstein noted that such words act as a kind of connective tissue, right? These kind of tea words, linking nodes in the trajectory from production to consumption. Tea words such as soft and stewy connect taste, smell, and appearance to events and to labor processes in the field and the factory. Tea words importantly work in combinations. Mr. Chetal's hypothetical stewy tea was also soft. A soft tea lacked briskness, a liquor that is alive like fresh spring water. It also lacked brightness, a liquor whose colorful pop would be visible even when mixed with milk. Seemingly straightforward words like cheesy, minty, or fruity do not reference the sensations of cheese, mint, or fruit. Instead, these words signal different kinds of taints in the teas imparted during storage and transport. Biscuity is a pleasant characteristic, and shoddy teas are not shoddy at all, but particularly well made. Spongy leaves are actually flat and flaky, and an earthy taste, while desirable in some wines, indicates that a tea was stored in damp conditions, while winey liquors are over-fermented, albeit in sterile conditions. So Mr. Chetal continued. The language of tea is an intra-trade language, right? So that's kind of key, right? It's an interior to the tea industry type of language. It's an intra-trade language, he said. He continues, right? Tea is unlike wine, whose language is applied towards the consumer. Wine terms are evocative, finely tuned, he stressed. They're pleasing. They generate emotion. Tea's terminology is distinct in that it is only an expert language. Consumers who drink tea will likely never know that tea words exist. Tea words are instead oriented back towards tea production, back towards the plantations. The origin of tea words lie as much in colonial agronomic science as in the colonial economy of prestige. So I want to kind of step back now from the contemporary tasting room in the brokerage house to discuss the historical meeting between science and prestige. So in 1911, the Indian Tea Association, again, or the ITA, established the Toklai Experimental Station in Jorhat, Assam. Early Toklai experiments, such as in areas such as pest management, were oriented to maximizing quantity. Right? So first imperative was to maximize quantity, right? Dovetailing with what Andrew Liu already talked about. Maximizing the quantity that British-owned tea plantations could produce. But by 1932, a global economic depression was underway, and consumer buying power was also at an ebb. Facing shrinking demand, tea plantations across the British Empire agreed to curb production and focus on making what they termed quality tea. So it was in this turn, this industry-wide turn to quality, that a chemist and meteorologist at Toklai named C.R. Harler first proposed a standardized glossary. Harler had observed brokerage practices, and he became frustrated that no one in the industry used a common language to describe the characteristics of tea. He elaborated his critique in a 1932 article, in which he complained not only that brokers' language was completely unstandardized, but also that there are a good number of terms used by individual tasters which convey little or nothing to the average planter. Thus, in one case, a tea infusion was described as tasting like a bandsman's tunic, and you can kind of all use your imagination as to what that might kind of taste like. Such an expression connotes unpleasantness and may denote sweatiness, but gives no definite guidance to a planter who wants to trace a shortcoming in his tea to some incorrect factory procedure. Phrases like bandsman's tunic, while long on poetics and certainly descriptive, were metaphorical. Their material reference lay outside of the chain of sights along which tea traveled. So Harler argued that it was possible to link tea words to production processes in a kind of one-to-one correlation. He proposed then to kind of make this happen, not just to kind of narrow the number of descriptive terms that brokers or tasters used, but to identify which chemical constituents of tea were responsible either wholly or in part for qualities like sweatiness or rawness, briskness, pungency, strength, color, or thickness, right? What are the kind of chemical relations between these qualities and the chemical relationships of these qualities and material kind of processes? Okay, so in 1934, the ITA submitted Harler's glossary to the Tea Brokers Association of London for comment. The tea brokers agreed to reduce their evaluative language to a finite number of terms. And they came up with a revised glossary, which was then forwarded to the ITA's Calcutta office for further refinement, in consultation again with top-class scientists. After several rounds of revision, the glossary was returned to the Tea Brokers Association in London for final revisions, followed by approval by the ITA's London-based Scientific Advisory Committee, which at the time kind of ironically had no scientists on it. But anyway, word by word, representatives from plantation, brokerage, and scientific sectors settled on terms for describing the qualities of dry leaves, steep leaves, and tea liquor. For example, and again, my animation's not going to work here, so just kind of follow along with what I'm saying. The term bakey refers to the taste of infused tea liquor. So the term bakey refers to the taste of infused tea liquor. In his original glossary, Harler defined bakey as a slightly high-fired tea. In the 1934 revision by the ITA London Committee and the Tea Brokers Association, they revised that definition to, quote, defective or faulty firing and sometimes slightly overfired. Once the glossary was returned to scientists at Tokeline, they amplified the definition further to add the phrase, certain instances of bakiness had been associated with bacterial infection. Well, when Tokeline's revisions were reviewed back in London by the Tea Brokers Association, they deleted that final sentence about bacterial infection. In the final glossary, published in 1938, bakey is defined as follows. Faulty firing, not necessarily at too high a temperature, but often due to leaves being too long or too thickly spread in the dryer. So Harler's efforts brought forth a debate about qualities definitions and boundaries in the industry. Take bakey. Tokeli scientists wanted to link a bakey sensation in tea to bacteria, but brokers and planters consistently rejected such direct causal references. According to brokers and planters, in order to be effective tools for maximizing quality, tea words needed to be standardized enough to be mutually intelligible, but not so standardized that they became distinct categories of goods and bads. So together, the words in the glossary were tools for keeping quality subject to experimental rediscovery. So at the same time, so as these revisions were going on, kind of instigated by Harler across London and Calcutta and Assam, in 1935, The ITA also appointed Cambridge University biologist Frank Engeldow to form the first of two commissions of inquiry he would eventually lead. One is pre-independence and one is immediately post-independence. I'm going to talk about the pre-independence one today. The commission's purpose was to identify a way forward for the industry in the context of depression-induced crop restrictions, looming world war, and a rising tide of anti-colonial sentiment. India would become independent by 1947, but even then, there was no clear sign that British capital would be expelled from the industry. Engeldow's mission then was to find a way to ensure the sustained dominance of British capital in the subcontinent after the formal end of empire. The picture here in this slide is a hand-drawn graph from Engeldow's notebooks, which shows the relative rates of consumption of tea, coffee, and cocoa in the UK. Engeldow was charged with ensuring the continued market dominance of tea over these other stimulants. And the Engeldow Commission's initial survey of plantation owners and managers revealed that the improvement of quality, as it was termed, remained the membership's highest priority. But Engeldow, the biologist, remained quite skeptical. After all, what counted as quality was still determined in large measure, nearly kind of exclusively, by a group of brokers whose practices remained completely illegible to science. Imperfect as it was, this new glossary that was being worked on had the potential to link British scientific practice, represented by Toklai, British aesthetic practice, represented by the tea brokers, and British productive practice, embodied in the tea plantation complex. So to do this, kind of like bring brokerage, to bring quality into, to make it a scientific variable, the Engeldow Commission proposed what he termed a new specification of quality, in which the professional broker would become, quote, a key member of the scientific staff. For the Commission, the objective scientific investigation should be to connect cause and effect, to understand the relationships between the sensory and material qualities of tea, as assessed by brokers, and notions of greater or lesser quality, as reflected in market price. Engeldow believed that this could be done if brokers not only used a controlled lexicon, but only the 5 descriptors you see here, hopefully that you see here, which are color, strength, pungency, quality, and flavor. Again, this is a snippet taken from his notebooks. With this limited lexicon, the broker's body would become a kind of laboratory instrument. Its measurements would be calibrated to a known standard by a set of practitioners in the new science of industrial chemistry. These 5 words, each correlated to a sensory experience of tea, namely of taste, look, and feel. Those experiences directly pointed to different aspects of plantation, field, and factory-based production. So between the 1940s and the 1950s, right, Engeldow kind of got what he wanted, and he kind of enrolled brokers in this large-scale investigation, this large-scale experimental process. So between the 1940s and 50s, chemists worked with panels of professional brokers to use these 5 terms and this strict criteria set out by Engeldow. For example, the tea's color would be judged as better than, equal to, or worse than a known standard, using the grading system you see here. Engeldow's goal, right, quite unveiled goal, was to make monetary pricing, the monetary pricing of tea, entirely subject to scientific scrutiny, and to slowly eliminate any hint of scientific, or to eliminate any hint of aesthetic sensibility from the market, to eliminate the broker as expert. Right, he really wanted to, eliminate brokers altogether. In the end, that mission, right, all of this kind of hyper-standardized, the elimination of brokers mission failed. Engeldow's 5 words never replaced a larger glossary, and science has not yet supplanted brokerage. But, and it's kind of a big, huge but, all of the work of the Engeldow and this commission and these decades of experiments did cement kind of the regimentation of laboratory practice in kind of what we see in the contemporary brokerage room, or tasting room at the brokerage house. So the brewing of tea in tasting rooms in Calcutta and in London came to be more standardized across different brokers and different brokerage firms, right? So that they kind of started to look the same. It began to be synchronized by precise clocks. weights and measures and volumes of water, and even the crockery out of which tasters slurp their teas, right? The British Standards Association actually has set the the measurements for those little white cups. We're now all kind of tightly articulated, all in the aim of assessing quality. Okay, so now just kind of towards a conclusion. While quality in capitalist markets is frequently posited as an end to itself, right, a thing out there in the world to be assessed, I would like to offer a different interpretation. Quality is not an endpoint. It's not a more or less than proposition. It's a material and semiotic variable, one that can be viewed and manipulated in a variety of sites. Brokerage is just kind of one of them. Quality is not just a slippery concept because it is subjective. Sure, that's a thing, but it's more than that. It's slippery. It's a slippery concept because it is shaped by changing material relationships. Stabilizing quality, then, requires not only disciplining feelings, but disciplining soils, machinery, and laboring bodies. And language, right, is kind of what I want to kind of draw your attention to with this talk and kind of in my larger work. Language is quite critical to that disciplining. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Besky, for your wonderful presentation on the linguistic and terminological aspects of tea and the curious ways in which its lexicon and meanings were subjectively structured as it meandered between scientific technicality and practices of quality in colonial times. But I feel sorry that you could not play all your slides to full effect, but thank you nonetheless. Our final speaker for the day is Dr. Debaruti Sen. Dr. Sen is currently Associate Professor in the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies at the University of Houston. She is an interdisciplinary cultural anthropologist with expertise on South Asia. With an MPhil from Delhi School of Economics and a PhD in anthropology from Rutgers University, Dr. Sen was associated with various other universities as well, especially at Kennesaw University as a faculty of conflict management and anthropology. Her first monograph, Everyday Sustainability, Gender Justice and Fair Trade Tea in Darjeeling in 2017, won her critical acclaim. At present, she is working on a second book project titled Subnational Enterprise, Militarization, Masculinity, and the Rise of the Right Wing in India's Eastern Border. Dr. Sen is also the co-editor-in-chief of the journal Culture, Agriculture, Food and Environment of the American Anthropological Association. The topic of her presentation today is emerging subjectivities around sustainable tea production in Darjeeling. I request her to kindly make a presentation. Dr. Sen.
Thank you. Shantanu, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, you're audible. Yeah.
Okay, great. I don't have any slides. It's going to be a presentation primarily based on a paper that I've been working on. Thank you, first of all, to Shantanu for a generous introduction, and also to Dr. Biswas and Rappaport for keeping us together in and also bringing us together in this conversation. I really am grateful for the generous invitation and all, and I know how much work it is to put together these kinds of events, although in virtual space. So I would like to also thank the Ramakrishna Mission at Vidyamandira and Shamiji's, and also everybody involved in the production of this event. What I'm going to talk about today is it touches upon various things that have already been mentioned briefly in the various presentations. And since our panel today has the subtitle Past and Present, what I would like to focus on is how the past and present come together in the subjectivities and the cultural productions around smallholder tea production. So, whenever we think of Darjeeling, the first thing that comes to mind is the plantation, right? And they definitely provide the order of reason. In Darjeeling, the geographical indications, as you know, unlike other artisanal productions, in Darjeeling, it is based on plantation borders, and we know that. But the arbitrariness and limitations of the geographical indications, and it has gendered consequences for smallholder tea farmers. And I'm going to talk, while most of my work has been with women producers in plantations and these non-plantation tea producers or producing areas and the people there. And I'm going to focus on sort of middle class male entrepreneurs and what they are using as tools to think through brand Darjeeling, because anything that is grown outside of the Darjeeling plantation limits is considered not officially tradable, but they are still reaching the world market and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to talk about today is how Darjeeling's youth entrepreneurs in the non-plantation sector are navigating, how they're navigating marginality in the tea industry and as ethnic Gorkhas through imagining their vision, their own vision of brand Darjeeling, to contest limitations of the GI articulated in the mandates of the local state about the legalities of tea production. Their discourse and practices to create a niche within the Western market for organic specialty Darjeeling tea draws on the 200-year colonial history of Nepali labor in Darjeeling's tea production and aspects of militarization and militarized tropes of contemporary Nepali subnational identity to articulate and animate their brand of Darjeeling tea. In the process, they put into play imaginaries, narratives, and practices that ground Darjeeling tea in a seemingly different regime of value that produce these sort of hybrid indigenities. For those of us who are familiar with the sort of the ethnic politics in the region, are well aware that it has been a struggle for Darjeeling Nepalis to sort of make their political position solidified, because they're not Adivasis, they're not sons of the soil. So these sort of tropes that are used while marketing and popularizing their tea has ramifications beyond just producing tea. As I say, it's a cultural production of becoming the sort of rightful national subject that they see themselves in. So despite generational outmigration from Darjeeling, many young men and women still aspire to stay close to the land. And I don't mean it to be in an essential way, but they like to find something close to home. They discuss, this is primarily because of the psychological exhaustion that comes with being in other places in India where they are racialized, along with people of India's northeast, other residents of India's northeast. And Papuri Bora actually writes a very nice article on saying why it is justifiable to use racialization as a term, to think to the kind of effects or ramifications of the violence that they face. It is quite common for young Nepali men who are in the army or any other moderately lucrative government or private sector career to invest in a piece of land in around Darjeeling's rural areas. And urban youth in Darjeeling often use the word Darjeelinge to demonstrate pride for hailing from this area. This perhaps gives young men a sense of subjective collective agency in a national and cultural climate that marks them in pejorative ways. Now, these emerging cultural productions, which have links to long histories of militarization, hard work, and location-specific hybrid indigenities, have now become part of the sustainability discourse. So therefore, in this paper, I analyze how upwardly mobile Nepali men in Darjeeling are questioning the limitations of plantation production, and in the process, producing self and community that mobilize sort of militarized identities, apart from other ways of maintaining a distinction. To question the colonial structures of plantation, the emergent interruption or subversion comes through this very roundabout and interesting process where militarized identities are mobilized to establish the non-plantation Gorkha palette, as has been frequently mentioned by these sort of upwardly mobile entrepreneurs. And two questions guide my inquiry in this paper: that how do male tea artisans maintain, and artisans is a word that I do not use myself, they use it themselves, how do male tea artisans maintain their edge in the niche economy of non-plantation Darjeeling tea, where colonial style plantations still dominate trade and representation? And how do they disrupt the familiar plantation aesthetic of Darjeeling as a place that enables the production of a distinct tea taste influencing ideas about authenticity as it pertains to this historic tea production. My contention here is that they do so by strategic cultural engagements, by suturing aspects of Darjeeling's colonial past and present day sustainability practices by placemaking. This involves drawing on long struggles and ethnic locations of Darjeeling Nepalis, known as Gorkhas or Gurkhas, to make claims about this hybrid form of indigeneity, although they are not from the soil but toiled long enough to create roots in this region. The generic label Gorkha, developed during the time of British occupation, has cachet in contemporary imaginings about Darjeeling in places where a large quantity of this tea is marketed and consumed, in England, of course, Australia, other places in Europe, and increasingly in the US. The mighty kukri-yielding Gurkhas were celebrated as loyal, hardworking servants of the British Empire, as opposed to Darjeeling's original inhabitants' lepchas. This image, and I draw from Queenie Pradhan's work here, who has written about these sort of ethnic distinctions within in Darjeeling's historical past. This image of a Gorkha, hardworking Gorkha, as opposed to a native lepcha, who's not probably as agreeable to all the colonial plans of agricultural expansion, still sort of drives. And I would like to quote from Pradhan's work a little bit to give you a taste of the kind of writings that existed. And she quotes from one of the sources in the archives, stating that dexterity, quote, the dexterity and resourcefulness was expressed in various ways in which they used their cookery. Slim, genteel, smiling, nimble Nepalese, armed with their universal kukri or short knife stuck in their grivels, with which they used to do the most wonderful things, and which is at one and the same time a pen, a knife, a carver, an axe, a toothpick, a hatchet, a spoon, a knife and fork, and all in one as a weapon of defense should occasion require, end quote. Pradhan further writes that this kind of trace-based evaluation of laboring capacity, worth, value, and dexterity and skill led to very interesting classified systems. And if you look, and you know, Darjeeling is also caste classified as a caste-based system that are very strong in the area, and a visible hierarchy is always discernible where. In this sort of polyglot population of Darjeeling, where everybody except a few people are outsiders. Contemporary labor and resource politics in Darjeeling is fought along these classificatory schemes. Nepali youth identify with their subnational identity through similar tropes of hard labor, honesty, dexterity, and their unwavering loyalty to the Indian nation state as protectors of national security, alluding to generations of military service. And this is what I'm actually trying to unravel in my other work right now. Amidst that general marginalization in mainstream Indian national discourse, these essentialisms and self-cultivated cultural productions are shared quite widely in the local life of Darjeeling. The effect of such discourse is sort of this hybrid identity and its therapeutic purpose in the lives of Nepali men. One of the most economically significant aspects of this Gorkha pride recur during my conversations with male interlocutors, both inside plantations, but mostly in non-plantation tea producing systems. In my ethnographic research in Darjeeling since the early 2000s, a recurring theme in discussions around inequities in the tea industry focused on the discussions around how Darjeeling Nepalis or Gorkhas have been deprived from the actual appreciating the taste of Darjeeling tea. There is a financial reason for such deprivation, since Darjeeling is considered a high-value plantation crop, and although it's only a fraction of India's total exports, a little bit lost in the exchange market. Mr. Thamang is one such entrepreneur, and I met him in the early 2000s when he had nothing to do with tea production. He was a local NGO worker, but he was also a certified organic inspector of IMO, the Institute of Market Ecology. Born and brought up in Darjeeling, Tamang developed close ties with non-plantation tea producers in Darjeeling's oldest organic and fair trade tea cooperatives. He opened, and in a few years ago, he opened an ecotourism business called Tathagata Farms, approximately 20 kilometers from Darjeeling town. In the land that he used for this business, there were wild tea bushes, as you could see in many parts of Darjeeling where the older plantations existed. Tamang nurtured these plants, and with a small group of employees from the adjoining villages, he tried to sort of harvest enough tea. He regularly hosts tea tastings with his mostly foreign and wealthy domestic clients visiting his beautiful farm. His farm has drawn a lot of attention from tourism-based international website TripAdvisor as one of the best eco-friendly homestays in Asia. Tamang to this day continues harvesting what he calls yellow tea and experimenting with ways to process and market them locally and beyond. You're surely going to get a pack if you visit his farm. In a recent conversation with Tamang about the future of Darjeeling's smallholder tea producers, he made the following comment to me, and I quote, "We need to develop a Gorkha palate. We, the people of Darjeeling, need to let the world know that we are capable of understanding our teas, processing them, and educating the world about it." End quote. This comment was powerful and resonated with so many other remarks made by plantation workers who are much less privileged than him, that they have been denied the taste of a product that they have toiled for. But at the same time, their hard work protects the Indian nation. Overall, what Nilambar Chetri calls the idiom of cultural exclusivity is high among Darjeeling Nepalis, and they use this sort of history of militarized labor to make claims that are ways of grounding the production of tea outside the plantations. So they are finding sort of these interesting routes to link past history with authenticity and indigeneity to continue this sort of cultural exclusivity. Many years ago in a plantation, I heard a young factory manager tell me that the British were very clever and they taught Nepalis about everything except taste. And this sort of lament forms the backdrop then of the counter narrative, which is of hard work and celebrating Pahari identity. In my other work with women tea producers outside plantations, who are basically smallholder farmers who cultivate tea alongside other crops, and many of their family members actually acquired social status by joining the army. So if you go to a village in Darjeeling, the Partane, Partan is a name for the army. If you go to the village, everybody knows which houses are products of military labor and service. And it's interesting that and I've written about this in my book, that women often use sort of military metaphors to talk about, how they protect the nation by sending their sons to the army, etc. And the same labor produces organic tea that is so valuable in the West, but they're still disenfranchised. The continuity of colonial ethnic classification that I detail is significant, and it is significant because that's become sort of a cultural route to tell stories about their productive capacity or to draw attention in new forms of solidarity building. In the intertwining of culture and political struggles of average Nepali men is channeled through this catch-all marker of ethnic exceptionalism, that is, of being a Gorkha. Tanka Bahadur Subba, a very renowned scholar writing about Darjeeling, talks about these predicaments of the Nepali everyday life, especially its political aspect. And he writes, interplays of identity and politics in the hills Gorkha, tribal or otherwise, stays, and further, while it is true that about a dozen communities are engaged in rediscovering, and he writes it in 2018, rediscovering their traditional identities, we cannot put the issue of Gorkha identity in the back burner, and it keeps coming about, and it's only natural that aspects of this identity formation. For instance, a lot of young men who roam around in the rural areas have a particular compartment associated with this military service. For instance, even before they actually appear for these massively competitive tests to get into the Indian Army, and there they're still recruited on the base of their caste, and that specifies what they're good at. They wear clothes with the army prints, and which is very common in the rural areas because they're very durable, and they don't tear easily in the rough monsoon impacted areas, and this deep-seated desire for recognition finally finds its way through these sort of allusions to a military past. For instance, there's another gentleman who I will now talk about briefly, and I'm looking at the time. Still have 5 minutes. Okay. This Nirula's farm, and Nirula's tea farm, which is a very popular establishment now in Darjeeling. They have a shop in the main area. They're distinctly, again, Mr. Nirula has actually been one of the most successful people in this sort of class of male entrepreneurs to actually challenge, make legal inroads into challenging the geographical indications in the recent political situation during the elections. I believe he had support from the BJP in taking this question forward, but we don't know what has happened to that at this point. But we'll stay tuned. In describing Mr. Nirula's farm and his efforts, I quote from Mr. Norman, a very famous tea blogger and writer, and I have to quote in length to show how this idea of Gorkha or Gorkhaness as something that alludes to or grounds this kind of tea production, of course, also evident in the fact that Mr. Nirula has won several international awards for the quality of his tea. Mr. Norman writes in a blog, "What makes the Nirula operation so unique is not the fact that it's a smallholder farm or a bottling factory, but rather it is a locally owned outfit. Bhavesh, which is the first name of Mr. Nirula, is a Gorkha," and he emphasizes the word Gorkha in this phrase. And he's producing recognized Darjeeling teas. That's kind of a big deal, and explain why. And he kind of makes a tongue-in-cheek comment, trigger warning, politics and history. He continues, "The Gorkha inhabitants of Darjeeling region aren't originally from there. They were brought over by the British from Nepal over a period of 100 years or so to work in the newly planted tea fields. Before their arrival, Darjeeling was mainly populated by the lepchas, who are too few and too uninterested in the labor-intensive process of tea picking, which is with good reason. At present, 90% of all Darjeeling tea estate labor force is predominantly Gorkha. Pay is low, working conditions are grueling, plus the tea plantation model hasn't changed much since the British era. Granted, some changes are happening, but not at the rate that can be considered quick or sustainable. Because of the low pay and working condition issues, political unrest has resulted in including a monumental strike of 2017. In the interim, Gorkha-owned and operated farms have cropped up here and there, some even producing their own teas by hand. However, their teas aren't officially recognized as Darjeeling teas because they aren't recognized by the the Tea Board of India. That's where Nirula's operation differs. Not only are the teas produced by Nirula's tea farm considered Darjeeling teas officially, but it is the first Gorkha-owned operation to be considered so. I quote at length from Mr. Norman's blog, which was written in 2018, to make apparent how the politics of hybrid indigenization unfolds in the minds of Westerners who want to support establishments like that of Nirula's tea farm. These kinds of media representations and blog-based advocacy are critical for the popularity and sale of Darjeeling teas of high quality that are so-called unofficially not recognized by the Indian Tea Board still, although they are making progress. The demand for Gorkhaland is also recognized as a legitimate power struggle by new socially conscious and creative sustainable tea entrepreneurs in the US who source from Darjeeling. This is evident from accompanying hashtags with other social entrepreneurs who are tea traders. Hashtags such as Gorkha, Warrior, Social Justice frequently appear in their description of Darjeeling tea producers, and why, particularly the ones who are out to support small farm based tea. If you look at Mr. Nirula's discourses, he very much is very conscious of the fact that he's appealing local youth to take on tea production, and you know, his dress, his comportment. He's often seen wearing sort of a military print jacket when he's giving interviews. He calls he challenges the geographical indications by misspelling the name of his outfit, the tea outfit in Darjeeling, calls it Camellia sinensis. And when somebody pointed out that, you know, there's a syllable missing, he said, "That's a deliberate error. I know what I'm doing." So he literally wears Gorkha pride on his sleeve, and this brand, new forms of branding, and it's sort of allusion to military labor, militarized forms of cultural production, questions of safety, authenticity, and creating alternative routes for male employment in a region that is always plagued by the dyad of opulence on the one hand and lack on the other, right? And a recent excerpt from another newspaper article describes Mr. Nirula as, "Nirula will be the real hero, the inspiration for next generation self-respecting entrepreneurs of Darjeeling." Mr. Nirula's legal activism to question the boundedness of geographical indications for Darjeeling tea, along with his various productions of Gorkhaness, complicates John and Jean Komarov's idea of ethno-commodity, which is very place-specific. For the Komarovs, ethno-commodity provides a conceptual tool to understand how culture itself is used to locate products in distinct cultural places and embed them in certain ways to enhance brand identity of such commodities in a transnational economy. In the case of Darjeeling small farmers, though, this sort of grounding takes a slightly different route, where counter-branding becomes a way or a cultural tool seen as a way to build resilience in a neoliberal market. But what these new cultural productions around Darjeeling tea make evident is the unmitigated ethnic marginality of people in Darjeeling, and finding new ways to express themselves in sort of sustainable tea cultivation and trade. So I'll end there, and hopefully other details I can share in the Q&A, but thank you for listening and devoting your part of your Saturday to this presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sen, for highlighting the ethnic subjectivities and identities of the Gorkhas in the tea terrain of Darjeeling, based on your anthropological field survey data from the post-colonial period. So I think we have been able to move throughout these presentations right from the beginning, from the colonial to the post-colonial period. So thank you again for that. And now we would move on to the final leg of today's presentation, which is going to be an interactive session. In this segment, Professor Erica Rappaport would give her remarks regarding each paper, and the speakers would respond to some of the questions that have come up regarding their presentations. Professor Rappaport needs no introduction, actually. She is one of the most recognized names in the academia on the history of modern consumer cultures. Her books, namely A Thirst for Empire, How Tea Shaped the Modern World in 2017, and Shopping for Pleasure, Women in the Making of London's West End, are considered to be classics in the field. So she doesn't need any introduction anyway. But I now request Professor Rappaport to kindly conduct the proceedings for this interactive session. Over to you, Professor Rappaport.
Thank you so much. And thank you all to our speakers for giving us really wonderful papers, but also I think really a taste of their larger works. And so I'm going to make some comments that will bring together some of the themes that I see emerging in all these papers, and then we'll open it up to questions. So one of the things that I think, well, it's actually terrific to have, as Professor Day is just saying, papers that go from the colonial to the post-colonial, and that allows us to see continuities and also ruptures in this long history. I first want to highlight, though, some of the key themes that I think are in common with all these papers, and then discuss each paper individually. So the first theme I think they all share is a notion that whether we're studying the past or present of tea, we simply can't understand global capitalism if we imagine commodity chains as linear. Both in the past and the present, I think we need to reject the overly simple story in which the global South labors for the global North. That narrative comes up a lot in contemporary economics and social science and advertising, actually, that you could see even in some of Lipton's advertising. I think that narrative obscures as much as it reveals. For example, it makes it very hard to see how Chinese merchants expanded the taste for tea globally in the 18th and early 19th centuries. It makes it very difficult to see the critical fact that workers in India were also consumers, and to think about consumption as a form of work. It also makes it difficult as well to concentrate on intermediaries such as the tea brokers and tasters who worked in private, quite unlike the celebrity retailer Thomas Lipton. So these papers are all, I think, methodologically innovative in that they break down that narrative. And they also all, I think, highlight the cultural work of distributors, manufacturers, entrepreneurs, and workers. So in that sense, they're actually breaking down a tendency to think that consumers are the only ones whose identities are shaped by the ingestion of commodities. So in other words, the cultural worlds of the producers are very visible in these papers too. And then I also think that our panelists are writing histories and ethnographies that complicate simple binaries such as East-West, producer-consumer, male-female. Instead, they're attending to the ideologies and technologies that structure notions of taste, landscape, modernity, and markets. So I want to turn to each paper and think about how that these themes emerge in the individual papers or the works more generally. So Professor Andrew Liu, for example, has given us an overview of what is really a fascinating book. The title, as he explained, is Tea War, A History of Capitalism in China and India. It came out with Yale in 2020. In this book and in his paper, Liu embeds economic thought in the structural history of this agricultural yet industrial commodity. He analyzed debates within Chinese economic history, Indian labor and nationalist history, and British imperialism. But especially as you saw in this talk today, he emphasized how competition, but also the exchange of ideas between China, India, and Britain made tea a global mass commodity. Liu further demonstrated that there's no simple transformation from slave to free labor. Technologies and factories were not necessarily or even primarily the key to profits, growth, and standardization, and race and gender structured the division of labor in the tea industry. Together and in competition with one another, Chinese, South Asian, and British merchants, politicians, and ideologues wrestled with issues such as the source of value in a capitalist economy, how to make workers and land productive, and how to best one's rival for global market share. We turn to similar issues in our second paper, but here we focus on a question that many planters and retailers asked when the tea industry began to produce surpluses in the late 1880s and 1890s. That is, how to transform the vast Indian population into a market of tea drinkers. Until recently, most research on advertising on tea has simply assumed that Europeans, especially the British, were the most important market and that their taste for tea had been forged in the early modern period and was relatively stable. However, all the speakers we've heard today have shown us how making tea is always about creating tastes, inventing markets, and making and remaking identities and labor. This is an ongoing, always contested global process. In Professor Liu's paper, we see how the rivalry between China and India was critical to the making of Indian tea, while in Professor Biswas's work, we enter a new era when China had receded from global markets and intense competition emerged between two British colonies, Ceylon and India. Such rivalries, coupled with large surpluses of tea piling up in warehouses, led to the expansion in the technologies and range of global advertising at the end of the 19th century. So studying the trajectories of Thomas Lipton and his advertising provides a useful way to trace the transformations in the global tea trade and in retailing and advertising in general. I'll give you a little bit more background about Lipton, and so that you can kind of place the ads in this sort of historical context. So Lipton's father had been a typical Scottish grocer with a pronounced distaste for innovation. He absolutely refused to advertise his products. Lipton might have followed in his father's footsteps had he not traveled to the United States, and he worked as a laborer on a tobacco plantation and a rice plantation in the South. And then he became an assistant in a high-class New York grocery store. It was in America, he claimed, that he embraced modern ideas of salesmanship and display. In 1871, he returned home and opened a small shop himself, small grocery shop in Glasgow, selling cheap bacon, eggs, butter, and cheese, largely imported from Ireland and the United States. Within a few years, he launched a major export business, and by 1878, Lipton's hams were selling as far afield as the West Indies. Thomas Lipton only began selling tea in 1889, radically changing the British market, though, when instead of charging 2 shillings a pound, Lipton priced standard teas at only 1 7 pence. This stunt drew attention both from the entire trade, really, but it also captured the attention of a group of London bankers who represented proprietors of several Ceylon coffee estates who wanted to sell up. Recalling his decision to buy a plantation in Ceylon, Lipton did not mention economics, but rather he wrote, "I rather like the sensation of being a tea planter." In his advertising and his autobiography, he then falsely asserted that he was the first owner of tea estates to act as his own retailer. After purchasing his first plantation in Ceylon in 1890, Lipton flooded the Western press with images of tea plantations, factories, and phrases that claimed his teas were imported direct from the garden to the teacup. His advertising sold a lot of tea by teaching working-class consumers to see themselves as white and to think of drinking tea as allowing them to share in the fruits of empire. At virtually the same time that Lipton targeted consumers in Britain and the United States, we learned that he also launched an ad campaign in India. Yet, even though he targeted the Anglo-British and Anglicized Bengali community, the ads are very different than those that you see in the West. In Lipton's ads, tea in India, that is, tea is a symbol of British colonialism, as we see here. As branded tea, it also suggests that capitalism was wholly Western and erasing the history that Andrew Liu documents in his book and in the talk we heard today. We simply don't see the fact that it was China, not the British, that created global markets and tastes. Branded and packaged tea, such as Lipton's, in many ways ended the tea war, in that these teas, so I want us to think about what's inside the package. They actually blended teas from China, Ceylon, and India. So in Professor Biswas's research, we see an issue, though, that about how really advertising, what it does, what did it do in India that was different perhaps than in England? In a period before market research, long before market research, I was thinking, how did Lipton envision the Indian market? Where did he get his ideas from? Did he perhaps rely on local intermediaries that we can't see in his ads? As Professor Biswas has argued in his dissertation on Indian advertising, which I've been privileged to read, Indian manufacturers advertised a great many mass commodities to Indians before Lipton arrived on the scene. So then Lipton was an agent of globalization, but he wasn't unique. And rather, I want to think further about how he was part of and profited from global and local networks that developed with the tea trade. So Professor Besky's book on tea, the recent book on tea, of which we got a taste here, considers how those global networks changed over the course of the last century. In her book, Besky traces how networks of expertise shifted as a result of independence and with various pressures inherent in post-colonial political economies. Colonial institutions such as the auction house and tasting room remained, but they took on new meanings in the late 20th century. Yet we still see how they produced notions of taste and quality. As a response to the Depression in the 1930s, the Indian Tea Association scientists created a standardized lexicon to create quality tea. This did not, though, as Besky shows, imply expensive or luxury. As Besky shows us, quality is equally important in the production of the cheapest of goods, such as 1 rupee packet of CTC tea sold and consumed all over India today. Besky describes as well how this very specialized language and classification system reinforced the class and gender identities of the business side of the trade. And in her book especially, she demonstrates how this modern capitalist industry also manufactured middle-class Indian masculinities. As tea brokers was, as you can see just from her slides, a wholly masculine profession. After reading Besky's book and listening to her today, I became especially interested in thinking about consumer advertising also developed a specialized language. As we see in Professor Lee's paper, there are ads that suggested that Western science implied quality. Consumers and retailers were told that the main difference between Indian and Chinese tea was technology, though as Andrew showed, there was in fact little difference between these teas. Lipton's and branding, which especially became dominant after the First World War, increasingly imagined the consumer and the retailer as ignorant. And the only knowledge that they had was that of the trusted brand. So you were told you don't have to think about the quality of tea, you just need to think about the brand. So advertising and branding assumed that the producer was masculine and trained, and the consumer was female and ignorant, guided by the brand. And I should say also the small retailer. They always assume the small retailer just needs to trust the brand too and stock the brand. As a question for further research, I wonder if we can think about the home and the shop as alternative sites of knowledge and whether domestic knowledge systems produce their own language or intersected in any way or altered in any way the tea trade more generally. So I think Professor Sen's work on the branding of Darjeeling and the subnationalism of Gorkha identity gets at some of these sorts of questions. In her talk and that of her work on Darjeeling, she takes us back to the plantation and the smallholdings and considers how the legacies of the colonial era literally flavored Darjeeling's tea, its economy, and its current politics. Her work in many ways shows us what's at stake today when we study tea. She's especially good at unpacking the consequences of forms of branding and classification such as GI, organic, and fair trade. Marketers had long established Darjeeling's reputation as the champagne of teas, but this term only gained comprehensive legal protections via the World Trade Organization, which granted it geographical indication or GI status in 1999. GI status implies that products and places are unique, or as the WTO's website notes, a product's quality, reputation, or other characteristics can be determined by where it comes from. So GI status then accepts the notion that the totality of an environment is what makes some products distinct. Professor Sen's work, I think, complicates this history by showing us how categories that brand tea as authentic or pure, either through GI, fair trade, or organic status, have created opportunities and exclusions. She further suggests that brand Darjeeling sustained a culture of difference that has seeped into contemporary Gorkha identity and politics. While many distinct local issues and histories have driven the Gorkha movement, in many ways, I think that this movement is somewhat like the Brexit referendum in 2016, in that both demonstrate in very different ways, of course, but the unfinished business of empire. In Darjeeling, as in the pro-Brexit voters in England, contemporary claims to independence rest on a memory of a benevolent empire that never existed. As Professor Sen shows us, the descendants of those who suffered directly from British exploitation are now relying on and producing a romantic vision of the Raj to sustain their place in Darjeeling's economy. And this is especially evident in the ecotourism and the former plantations that have been turned into luxury stays. The situation in Darjeeling is an example, I think, of a key problem for most post-colonial nations. Namely, is there any way to remake capitalist industries that were so inextricably tied to empire in ways which do not replicate colonial ideologies, identities, and environments. Given the exigencies of global markets and the power of multinational corporations, is it possible to build a truly sustainable and equitable tea trade? During the 1920s, Indian nationalists and labor movements did not think so. They contended that for an Indian to drink tea was to become a colonizer who profited from the unfair treatment of the poor worker toiling in the gardens. Well, tea was never subject to full-scale boycotts. Peasants did interrupt promotional tea lectures, refused free tea, closed tea shops, and shouted statements such as, "I will never drink tea as it would be drinking the blood of my brothers." Retailers who supported non-cooperation recognized that the Indian Tea Association was effectively an arm of the colonial government. This led the Indian Tea Association employees and advertisers to relentlessly argue that tea was good for Indians and an Indian good. They used decades of advertising and the kind of language and scientific classifications that Sarah discussed to remake tea, tea makers, and tea drinkers, to basically make tea an Indian good. As we've seen today, though, tea's long history is still present in every cup, which may be delicious, but always leaves a slightly bitter taste of colonialism. So I want to thank all our speakers, and I want to end there and maybe just have us think about an absolutely unanswerable question. But I think I've just wrestled with this problem throughout my work, is really, how can we create a kind of truly sustainable and equitable tea trade? Because as it is, I mean, people absolutely love tea, but then, you know, it is, of course, a real problem with a industry that is so built on the colonial capitalist systems. So I'll end there. I think, so you guys are unmuted. We could start to take questions, or I don't know if you have any responses that you'd like to start with, any kind of comments, either based on what I said or what other papers have said.
I think, Erica, we can just move on to the questions, and each speaker can respond to the questions which have come up.
Okay,
starting
great.
with the sequence perhaps of the speakers that we have had, starting with Professor Liu. Yeah.
I saw one question for me about tea production in China, right? And so the main difference was that I briefly mentioned this. You know, the tea production, or the tea industry, was organized basically like all pre-industrial industries were organized, which is to say it was very segmented. You had independent producers, you know, just basically farmers, families that would like micro grain or, you know, do other stuff, and on the side they would grow tea, and that was always like a side hobby for a peasant family. And then networks emerged in which, you know, those farmers lived in the countryside. They would go to a tiny little market town where they sell the tea, and that image I showed, and so on and so forth. And the contrast was that Indian tea was vertically integrated, right? It was centralized, where the tea planting, growing, processing, drying, packaging all took place relatively in one estate, right? And this was, again, a very clear contrast, both at the time in the sort of planter manual literature, but also by historians and social scientists, for, you know, drawing a contrast between sort of pre-modern and modern forms of production. One thing I was trying to show, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, by the way, obviously, like vertical integration, economies of scale, having lots of capital put into a tea plantation makes a difference. One thing I was trying to show, though, was like, just because the Chinese tea sort of network looks like it had not been changed from like the 18th century to the 20th century, right? In fact, if you look closely, you do see the exertion of the influence of capital, you know, starting from like like European capital to the treaty ports, and then you can kind of trace this chain of loans that go from, like, you know, HSBC Bank maybe to a European merchant who funds the Chinese merchant who funds the local sort of countryside merchant, and they have these very like crude loan systems, right? And at first it looks very like traditional and pre-modern, but if you kind of break it down and kind of draw these little charts, it looks, it's not vertically integrated, but there's certainly a way in which the global market is kind of still shaping, you know, tea production in the countryside in a way that's not obvious, but it's very through these sort of subtle, invisible market sort of thing. So that's one thing I was trying to show, which is, again, to downplay the fact that, yes, like tea plantations are factories in the fields, right? And Chinese tea is grown in the way that most sort of small scale agriculture is grown, and that's a huge difference. But just trying to show like these are differences of degree and relative degree rather than like of absolute, categorical differences. I don't know if there's any other specific questions for me. Oh, one other, I saw someone asked, where does the word tea come from? It comes from the Chinese term in Mandarin is cha, and I'm sure everyone has seen those charts, right? That show like half the world says tea, which comes from the Fujianese pronunciation, something like di or something like that, and then half the world pronounces as cha or some sa or something like that, and that is a reflection of the fact that there's different, pronunciations of the word in China, and different parts of the world got tea from different parts of China, and that is reflected in how they pronounce it. And I think that I in Chai, this is Philip Lukendorf had this theory, and then Victor Mayer also has this theory that the I was added because of, in Persian, I guess, I's are added to the ends of words, so that was like it was like a Mughal thing to add the I to cha to chai.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I saw there was a question about Lipton's ads, I think, that basically was asking more about the differences between both English and Bengali newspapers. Did you see Lipton's ads in both, but also between the ones you saw and more the typical ones that we know from in the West?
Yeah, thank you. This is, who's this? Joyshmita, thank you for your comment. I've already mentioned the source of the advertisement. It was specifically from the Bengali. And I actually looked through a lot of primary sources, both newspapers and journals. But at that particular moment, this I chanced upon this advertisements when I was doing my doctoral degree, like I mentioned, and unlike in the West, you don't have dedicated archives except perhaps the one on tea, which Gautam Bhatta and the CSSS has. But if you have followed my ads, you must have seen that it's from an earlier period. Okay, so my dissertation actually, the period which I'm looking at is 1920. By that time, you have ads in various journals such as Balok, Bongobashi, Bonik, Bhandar, and Bharat Mahila, stuff like that. But the main difference is with regard to the illustration, the quality, which was still woodcut. And let me tell you that advertisements were very expensive. So very few advertisers till 1920 at least, and this is based on a comprehensive survey of various newspapers which I've seen, and particularly Bengali and Amrita Vaja Petrika, that very few advertisers would actually illustrate their advertisements. Okay, so till about 8, 9. Of course, once in a while, yes. More in journals if they were weekly, and Punjika because it was yearly. But otherwise, it's very difficult to make out. But the ones which I showed, which was of course in Bhattacharya's tea, Mukherjee's tea, or I.B. Gupta's tea, etc. Those were the types which were typically advertised and translated into the Bengali language. Okay. And newspaper and these your merchants and advertisers would usually choose those newspapers where circulation and readership is very high. So that was also one criteria. But if you're specifically looking for archives, CSSS is a good place to start your research. If you're looking for specific insights.
So I see here a really interesting question. I think maybe Debaruti or Sarah might be able to answer it, but are there myths pertaining to the effects of tea consumption, such as there have been regarding pepper, ginger, cinnamon, what are these opinions of medical experts? It's kind of interesting about how I know there was one myth that about that tea and opium were so completely intertwined in their trade in the period that Andy was talking about, that so a lot of people thought they were one and the same, and so that, they were so exchanged. So I don't know if you guys have encountered that kind of thing in your work. It's interesting about just the stories that consumers end up sort of creating around the commodity too.
Right. In fact, as Erica just stated, in fact, there's a friend of mine, Bodhisattva Kaur. In fact, he has made this this distinction between invigorating tea and enervating opium. So this distinction goes as in there's a difference in the way in which the two consumable items functioned in their product nature.
Yeah, and Erica, your book, you talk about how tea, what I found was interesting is tea was always, all these caffeinated drinks, tea and coffee, always arise as sober drinks.
Yes.
Right. And I thought it was interesting because I actually kind of think that's also true of how it arose in Asia several centuries earlier as a Buddhist drink and to replace alcohol. So that alcohol caffeine contrast seems almost like universal in the history of these beverages. Coffee did, right?
Yeah.
I found the association between war and tea drinking in Erica's book quite fascinating. Especially the Indian soldiers, you had some great pictures in your book of amazing. But I feel like tea consumption in Darjeeling, at least, is a class based issue. So for like average workers, tea is almost like food. There's hardly any tea. It's like a lot of sugar, a lot of milk, and actually a lot of salt in certain instances. So that's how they drink their tea. So the fact that when tea was offered to me, I just drink it without any of these things. Of course, that shows the kind of tea I drink. But they used to be very surprised. They said, "Where will you get the energy? There is no sugar, there is no milk. So what are you going to do? Like drink that water and just like go around the entire day?" So sometimes when they don't have.
Let's see. Oh well, she froze.
It's all kachi.
Oh, there you are.
So, but in Nepali, it's not like that. But I think, but in the upper classes, if you look at these same entrepreneurs who are selling yellow tea, pink tea, whatever you have it, they are always talking about medicinal properties, right? And they do say that, in England, Bengalis, of course, are infamous for stomach problems. So now, at least when I was growing up, there was no green tea in Kolkata. There was no green tea being consumed, like milk and sugar or bigger cha, but that's what we say. But now people are drinking all kinds of green tea, and the domestic market for green tea, I feel like it keeps proliferating, and now they're in like sodas and whatnot. So I feel like the attribution of quality and its health benefits are based on where you are in that and if you talk to CTC producers, their biggest threat is cola, because a lot of younger generations are apparently now drinking tea. Although I don't know how that works, because I see like new tea places in Calcutta all the time now, in South Calcutta in particular. So I don't know the specific numbers, but there is a concern that the cola war is a big problem for them. So that's all I have to say. There was some question in here about tea versus coffee in India. Now that's a regional question. Because if you go to southern India, people are producing, there are coffee plantations, and people are drinking coffee, even in the plantations. So it's a question of where you are. But I guess tea outnumbers coffee in terms of its popularity in the West, in the East, in the North, etc. So anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, one can probably read A.R. Venkatachalapathi's book on coffee if interested. Yeah.
Yes. Exactly.
I mean, I was interested, Sarah, I wonder if you could talk more. It was sort of a hint in your paper about the differences between the kind of language of tea and then the wine industry, which, as you said, that language has shifted outwards from the producers to wine connoisseurs and the whole, culture of wine tasting, etc. But in tea, I think it was fascinating. You said this language is a trade language, and that is so fascinating that it's like a whole distinct. And as you say, the words don't mean what they mean to the average person, or even I think the shopkeeper, for example, or grocer. So, I mean, I wonder if you could think a little bit about why tea is maintained, that language has stayed within the industry and not moved kind of into that. I guess there isn't the same culture of the connoisseur quite the same way, but if you wanted to speak more about that.
I mean, sometimes it's kind of hard in a way to kind of talk about what doesn't happen.
Yeah,
but it's like, let me, there's, I mean, there, and that kind of like, the kind of tea wine kind of comparison always kind of, elite in the academic literature, often, especially with the advent, especially having worked in Darjeeling with the whole kind of GI stuff, right? That's this kind of like natural comparison that's always kind of rendered. But what's interesting is that actually that's how tea brokers kind of think about the kind of difference that makes a difference with how they kind of do their work of evaluation, that it isn't something that anyone can train in, right? That is then therefore exportable. Right, the kind of the means by which you become a tea broker, right? There's this, quite regimented employment kind of hiring practices, right? That I can kind of explain. Whereas, and then that language, right? Obviously, right? That these words are quite bespoke in their meaning. But I think what's interesting is that when you see, and I think this is actually particularly relevant in terms of like the marketing of what kind of Debaruti is talking about with regards to the kind of the burgeoning kind of market for kind of small grower tea from Darjeeling, from Assam sites, right? The kind of the way that stuff is sold on these kind of very kind of white and black kind of bougie, tea websites from, like the Art of Tea or this or that, right? The tasting notes are wine tasting notes, right? They're kind of like brought in. The kind of the language is one of distinction, right? It is one of kind of refinement, and it is not that glossary. And that's what I mean. What made me interested in the tea glossary as it was being regimented is that each of those words were supposed to be these kind of indexes for production, right? That like if it's like if I say this, it means this. If I say this, it means this. Right. Right. So that as a kind of communicative infrastructure between plantations and brokers, it was never ever meant to travel outside of the site of brokerage.
Yeah, but Sarah, your presentation, I just had a query which is from an outsider basically. But do you find any form of hierarchization in this usage of terms that you find in terms of quality or in terms of its medical benefits? Or do we find a hierarchization, say for example, between the tea produced in Assam or in Darjeeling or in other parts of the world? Does it happen in the linguistic sphere as well?
And that's what's interesting, like the same language, right? There's differences between Orthodox and CTC as kind of different production processes, but there's the same kind of glossary is applied across these. So the auction, right, for the Calcutta auction and Siliguri, right? So a Calcutta auction has 4 categories: Darjeeling, Orthodox, CTC, and CTC dust. Siliguri, for example, is CTC and CTC dust, right? Other auctions, right, have Darjeeling is the only place that Calcutta is the only place that Darjeeling's auction. So like Guwahati has Orthodox, CTC dust, right? So the Orthodox auction is all using the same tea words, right, for the evaluation of that. And like in terms of like the hierarchy of regions, right, that is not necessarily at all reflected. I mean, certainly there's qualities that may be more attainable in the climatic region, in the climatic zones of Upper Assam or Lower Assam versus Darjeeling versus something else, right? But there's not like that. The geographical changes, like geographical hierarchies, aren't necessarily reflected in the way that the words are deployed, I would say.
Hey, I have a
question differently.
What's
that?
So how, Sarah, this is a question for you. I mean, it is very interesting. Then is there any correlation between the price of the tea and how these words are? I guess I should read your book, but since you're here, I'll just indulge. But I mean, it just seems so arbitrary because the same terms are used for all 4 categories, but then we know there's a huge price difference along the chain. But then they're using the same words. So like, who gets to decide?
Well, the brokers get to decide. But I think what's key here, and this is like part of, you know, what I kind of talk about in the book, is that normativity is kind of key to understanding quality, right? Mm-hmm. So the way that a grade of CTC from the doors is supposed to kind of be is kind of the thing that is worked with and manipulated. Right, so that they're like, quality is inseparable from the way that something is supposed to be, right? This kind of these abstract notions of, but with not that it's definite, but it's that there's this like historical genealogical kind of characteristic to that. And so yes, obviously there's a huge cavernous difference, right? But there's some words that again are not going to be used to describe Orthodox teas. But like then there's the ones that kind of move across all of these categories, like the kind of the ones that you hear a lot, right? Like bloom and brightness and briskness and color and that's, I mean, whether a tea could have color and be worth 18,000 rupees a kg or 100 rupees a kg, or it would probably, if it had, maybe actually if there was something else aberrant in it and it still had color, it could be 100 rupees a kg, right? Because the brokers are kind of looking at teas, especially, right? This is not the bourgeois single origin market, right? This is tea that's going to kind of end up in blends. So, right, how a broker kind of engages with a tea is that it will always, it's thought to be always already part of something else. Right, so it's kind of this, so that's kind of also how it's thought about too, in terms of how it's valued, right? So even if something is off about it, right? There's like, it doesn't look right, but it has really good color, right? That could be quite desirable to a blender who wants to keep the price of his tea down, for example.
I thought it was interesting, like, to think about the ways in which, since the beginning of the Indian tea industry, as Andy was showing us, technology, that's you're talking about the civilizational war between China and India. And it's technology that the 1880s ads or 1870s would say it's the Western technology that makes the tea quality. So that's that kind of long-term origins of that. At the same time, like, we see this constant tension between, that phase really critiques that hand production, small holding tea that's in China that now is being brought back in this other way. So it's kind of fascinating. You need to have the mass market teas, the Lipton teas, to get that tension. It's always part of this tension between the smallholder, hand producing. It was either dirty, sweaty, disgusting, or fine, quality, expensive. So that's a real flip that's happened.
Yeah, I mentioned this. There. I think I mentioned this in my epilogue where I was citing Sarah's article. It might be in the book as well. She mentions the phenomenon of bought leaf factories, right? Which is to say that I think well, Sarah can explain it, but I think what had happened with a lot of the tea industry was it had like de-integrated from having centralized plantations and manufacturing, so like segmenting it and saying those who produce the leaf are responsible for the leaf, and then the people who manufacture it are just responsible for that. And in a way, it starts to look like the Chinese networks of the 19th century that were criticized as being inefficient and disintegrated and not centralized. But now, as part of like, neoliberal flexible production methods, now that's like come back into vogue and is seen as a cost-cutting measure that reduces overhead costs and so on and so forth. So, and I also think like, like people have talked about the sort of pendulum swing from like in the 20th century, there was this emphasis upon like economies of scale and standardization. And then post 70s and 80s, we go back to like, artisanal niches rather than mass standardization. I think, a lot of that stuff, to me at least, helps me make sense of what's happened in the last couple of decades.
Recently, And then teas like Lipton's are on that. Of course, they're still.
Or I mean, it's niches. It's niches. Niche. We had this conference where Sarah and I attended at Cornell a few years ago, and it was really interesting to see like, there's Sarah's talking about like high-end teas, and then there's presentations on like bubble tea in Asia, which comes from like tea farms in Thailand, which are like crap teas, right, and are just immediately ground into powders for their tannin, and that's it, right? And it's not as if like one is going to replace the other. They just kind of occupy different niches. And I think part of the other story is just, you know, in history, we talk about like, oh, the Western market, the global market. Well, right now it's also about the bourgeoisification of Asia, right? And the demand for different types of tea in Asia itself, like bubble teas versus high-end teas and all that stuff. And I think that's also driving diversification of tea production in the 21st century.
Oh, that's just.
I remember one. This is you know, a photographic essay. I think you might have read it. It's by Robert Gardella. It you know, it actually has those, you know, pictures of, you know, Chinese workers standing and, you know, kind of crushing tea with their feet, and also I mean, I think those images also created a kind of impact when they were printed in newspapers and all.
Yeah, which brings me, I mean, in a way, I really do think that race really operates on all these papers, and to think about race and capitalism, not just in a kind of very simplistic way that, you know, oftentimes, you know, like obviously, as Andrew was pointing out, slavery was really undergirding a lot of the profits that kind of then seeped into particularly the British capitalism that then, you know, goes all over. But that, you know, it's present in the marketing, in these subnationalisms that we're talking about in Darjeeling. It's kind of getting erased, I think, by the classification system in your paper, Sarah. It's so interesting how it's just like the tea is taken from any bodily, you know, experience into this sort of very specialized sphere, in this transformed in that way. But that's really interesting to think about. I'm thinking about where do we need to go in terms of the scholarship on tea, and, you know, thinking about the way it has created these global color lines, and, you know, the idea that tea advertising, production, distribution, all of it kind of contributes, not just labor that you could see in these papers. But I think I wanted to see, there was another paper here, question about sort of, did exporting tea from British India create new markets for India? I'm not quite sure what that means, but is it markets? And I think one thing that tea markets, the exporting of British Indian tea happened globally. It didn't just go to England. So that's something that's really important, that they happen at the same time. You know, the creation of tea markets for Indian tea in the late 19th century, we see it being advertised in Australia, United States, Canada, you know, in some parts of Africa, and then much late, you know, later in Africa as well. And then of course in India, and lots of tea planters were fascinated by the idea, should we spend a lot of money to try to market to the United States? And their vision of the US was like, well, they're British, why, you know, it's just the American Revolution that got them off the tea market, you know, got them misguided. Or should we just create markets in India? And so the same people, the planters, and particularly the Indian tea associations, wrestling with that question. And they recognize that both India and the United States are underdeveloped markets. And it's interesting they use that language for both, even though they recognize they're different. And yet they still spend money throughout. It's still today people trying to create tea markets, tea tastes in the United States. The US is a big market, but it's not, per capita consumption still very low compared to the rest of almost everywhere in the world. But I always thought that was interesting, that like those two big markets were very present in producers' minds. So thinking about, in general, markets for India. So it's not just Britain. I think the history of tea has been Britain's been too central in that history. And that, you know, obviously it's a very, very important market, but sometimes if you just focus on British tea drinkers, you're not seeing these other processes that we see today. So that would be kind of my answer to that. I don't really see other questions there in the chat. Let me see if I can see any more.
Yeah, I think we don't have any more questions. But if any of the speakers want to clarify their positions further, they can do so if they want to. But anyway, we have spent quite a lot of time, I think, dwelling on these issues. So finally, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Rappaport and to all the speakers of today's international webinar. I'm sure we have all been enriched by the presentations made, and I sincerely hope that the presentations can be carried forward and published in some manner in an edited volume or so sometime in the future. So with those words, I think I would now request Professor Gautam Mukhopadhyay, my fellow colleague and in the Department of History of Ramakrishna Mission Vidyamandira, and the coordinator of this international webinar to offer the formal vote of thanks. Gautam, yeah. Jeet Maharaj, I think you need to bring Gautam in the screen. Jeet Maharaj, are you around? I think Gautam needs to be brought into the main screen.
I think there might be a limit in terms of it can only show 6. So he said he's on backstage.
I would just exit myself. I would just exit myself so that he can make his way in. So anyway, thank you all of you, and hope to meet you sometime. Yeah.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Sure.
Thanks very much.
There he is.
Thank you. Finally, I just entered, and from very beginning, I was there in the backstage, and I was enjoying the lectures, discussions, and on behalf of the institution and on behalf of the Department of History, Ramakrishna Mission Vidyamandira, I would like to thank all of you, especially the faculty members of the Department of History, University of California, and Professor Erika Rappaport for being with us and for giving us the opportunity to organize this kind of collaborative event. And also, I'd like to convey my thanks to Dr. Prithwiraj Biswas, my colleague and HOD, Associate Professor and HOD, Department of History, Ramakrishna Mission Vidyamandira, for taking the initiative to organize such an event on behalf of our department. And I'm feeling proud to announce that this is the first time in the history of our institution that we are collaborating with a university from abroad. And I would like to thank our principal Maharaj for giving us the opportunity to organize this webinar and for his beautiful welcome address in the inaugural session, and also the monastic members of our college for their Vedic chanting in the inaugural session. And also, from bottom of my heart, I would like to convey my gratitude to the speakers, Professor Andrew B. Liu, Dr. Prithwiraj Biswas again, and Professor Shara Veski, and Dr. Debaruti Sen, and also again Professor Erika Rappaport. And also I'd like to thank Professor Shantanu De, today's moderator and Associate Professor, Department of History, Ramakrishna Mission Vidyamandira, for his painstaking job along the webinar. And also I would like to thank my departmental colleagues for their continuous support, and the student volunteers for their support from the backstage, and the technical support team, especially Jeet Maharaj, and also the office staffs, especially Mr. Ranjan Biswas. And finally, I would like to thank our viewers for their patience and for their for attending the seminar. And finally, I would like to conclude with an important announcement on behalf of our institution. Please note, no feedback link will be provided for certificate. Certificates will be sent to the registered email ID of pre-registered candidates only within 30th June 2021. I repeat, within 30th June 2021. If not received, please write us to the email ID given in flyer. So finally, again, I would like to thank you all, and stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you all. Namaskar.
Thank you, Erika, Sarah.
Thanks, everybody.
Andrew. I hope we kind of
quite late in.
Yeah, it's about 10:30 in.
Oh,
wow.
That's okay. Not very.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you very much.
I'm super amused by the Darjeeling History Club. I want to know more about.
I know. It was great.
Oh, horrible. Is it a student thing or no?
Sorry?
There's a Darjeeling History Club who was in our little
We're
discussion.
gonna have to find out about it.
I'm going to Google it.
Yes,
And
that's so great.
And
So I think we should end the live show. Then
Oh.
we can discuss. So Jitbar, please end the live show. Bye everybody.
see you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. I know I'm gonna go get a cup of tea.